Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep, and I am here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It was late September, just as summer had started giving way to fall. The kind of nights where the air is still warm but carries that first crisp bite, a reminder that colder days were on their way. I had just moved into a new apartment, a small but comfortable place on the fourth floor of a building that had clearly been standing for decades. The walls were thick, the floors creaked underfoot, and the elevator had an unsettling habit of stopping for a second longer than necessary between floors. But it was cheap, close to work, and most importantly, mine. I lived alone, which was something I had always wanted. No roommates, no one else's mess or noise. Just my own space, my own routine. It felt like a step forward in life, a new chapter. The first few weeks were normal: work, coming home, eating dinner in front of the TV, and scrolling through my phone until I finally passed out. The layout of the apartment was simple: a small living room connected to an open kitchen, a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom and bathroom. It wasn't anything fancy, but I liked it. There were two large windows in the living room that overlooked the street below, and at night, the city lights cast a soft glow against the walls. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional sound of my upstairs neighbor walking around late at night. Most of my time was spent between work and home, and honestly, nothing ever really happened that was worth mentioning. My routine was simple: wake up, make coffee, scroll through my phone while eating breakfast, go to work, come home, heat up something for dinner, watch TV, sleep. The kind of repetition that makes you feel like nothing will ever change. That night, the night everything shifted, was just like any other. I had come home late, exhausted from a long day, and decided to shower before bed. The hot water felt good against my skin, washing away the stress of the day. When I stepped out, I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 11:47 p.m. I sighed. Another late night. I dried off quickly, pulled on a pair of sweatpants, and wandered into the kitchen. The fridge hummed quietly as I grabbed a bottle of water. The apartment felt unusually still, but I didn't think much of it. Flipping off the kitchen light, I made my way to the bedroom. I was just about to close the door when I heard it. A knock. Not from my front door. No, this came from somewhere else. Somewhere inside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was soft, deliberate. 3 knocks. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkened apartment. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. Everything looked exactly as it should. For a moment, I considered the possibility that I had imagined it. Maybe the pipes? Maybe something outside? But then, before I could push the thought away, it happened again. 3 slow knocks. This time, I was sure, and they were coming from inside my apartment. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. Just 3 slow, deliberate knocks, like someone politely trying to get my attention. But the problem was, I was alone, and I knew for a fact that no one else had a key to my apartment. I stood there, my back against the bedroom doorframe, listening. The silence that followed was suffocating, wrapping itself around me like a heavy blanket. My pulse thumped in my ears, and I felt my breathing grow shallow, like my body was bracing for something before my mind could even process it. I forced myself to move, slowly stepping into the living room, my bare feet pressing against the cool wooden floor. My apartment wasn't big, but at that moment, it felt endless, every dark corner suddenly holding the possibility of something unseen. I turned on the nearest lamp, its dim glow spreading just enough light to cut through the darkness, but not enough to make me feel any safer. My eyes darted around the room, scanning every surface, every shadow. The kitchen? Empty. The windows still locked. The front door shut, deadbolt firmly in place. But then, as I stepped further in, something caught my eye. The closet door. It was open. Not wide open, but just enough to leave a sliver of darkness between the door and the frame. The thing was, I never left it open. Ever. I had a habit of making sure it was shut before bed because something about an open closet at night always unsettled me. It was one of those small, irrational fears I never outgrew. I stared at it, my brain racing to come up with an explanation. Maybe I had left it open earlier and just hadn't noticed. Maybe it had drifted open on its own. But then, knock, knock, knock. I felt my stomach twist. The sound came again, but this time it wasn't from the closet. It was from the bathroom. 3 slow knocks. I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. The bathroom door was closed, just like I had left it. But now, standing in the dim light of the living room, I could see something that made my blood run cold. The light was on. I knew for a fact I had turned it off when I left. I always turned it off. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Every logical part of my brain screamed for an explanation, faulty wiring, a trick of my memory, something reasonable. But the heavier, more instinctual part of me knew better. Something wasn't right. I took a shaky step forward, then another, my breath coming in uneven bursts. My fingers trembled as I reached for the bathroom door handle. I hesitated. And then, just as I was about to touch it, the light switched off. I stumbled backward, my heart slamming against my ribs. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My legs felt like they weren't even mine anymore. I stood there, locked in place, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. But the apartment was silent again. The kind of silence that felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. I forced myself to move, slowly backing away, my eyes locked on the bathroom door. I grabbed my phone from the counter, my fingers gripping it so tightly they ached. I didn't want to open the door, but I also couldn't just ignore what had happened. Summoning what little courage I had, I stepped forward again and pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty, but the mirror was fogged up. Like someone had just been in there, breathing. I felt a sharp, cold weight settle in my chest. I had just taken a shower, but that was nearly 20 minutes ago. The mirror should have cleared by now. There was no reason at all, for it to be fogged up like that. I reached out with a shaky hand and wiped at the glass. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed, pale. And then, the closet door creaked. I spun around so fast my vision blurred. The closet, the one I had just seen open a crack. It was wider now. Not much, just a few inches more, but enough to send every hair on my body standing straight up. I stared at the darkness inside, waiting. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. But I wasn't stupid. I wasn't about to check. Without thinking, I turned and slammed the bathroom door shut, locked it, pressed my back against it, and gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles ached. I had never felt fear like that before. A fear that didn't make sense, but was undeniably real. It crawled up my spine, settled in my chest, made my limbs feel weak. I told myself to calm down, to think. But the more I thought, the worse it got. Because I knew that I had locked the front door. I knew I had been alone. And yet, something else was in here with me. I stood there, pressed against the bathroom door, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The apartment had never felt this wrong before. I could feel it, a presence. Not something I could see, not something I could name, but something I could feel. The air was heavy, thick, pressing down on my chest like an invisible weight. My mind raced for an explanation, But every logical thought crumbled under the sheer force of what I had just experienced. A fogged-up mirror, a closet door opening on its own, a bathroom light turning on and off by itself. Sucks. None of it made sense, but it was happening. I forced myself to take a deep breath, my fingers tightening around my phone. I could call someone, but who? What would I even say? Hey, I think my apartment is haunted. No one would believe me. Hell, I wouldn't believe me if this hadn't just happened. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I needed to check the closet. Every instinct in me screamed not to. Every horror movie I'd ever seen told me this was a terrible idea. But what was I supposed to do? Ignore it. Pretend it wasn't happening. No! I had to see. My legs felt stiff, like they didn't want to move, but I forced them forward. The wooden floor was cold beneath my bare feet as I stepped out of the bathroom. The apartment was still, but not in a comforting way. The silence felt off, like it was listening. I reached the closet, standing just outside its partially open door. The gap was just wide enough to see nothing. Pure blackness. The kind of darkness that felt too deep, like the space inside was somehow bigger than it should be. I swallowed and lifted my hand. Slowly, carefully, I gripped the edge of the door and pulled it open. Creak. The sound made my stomach twist. I flicked on the closet light. Nothing. Just my clothes, my shoes, and a few storage boxes stacked in the corner. Everything exactly how it should be. I let out a shaky breath and exhaled, laughing at myself. I'm losing it. But just as I turned to close the door, something shifted. Not a noise, not a movement. A feeling, like something was right behind me. My entire body went rigid. The air in the closet felt colder now. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't want to look. I had to look. Slowly, so slowly it was agonizing, I turned my head, just enough to catch a glimpse of the mirror on the wall across from the closet. And that's when I saw it. A shape. Not a reflection of me. Something else. Something tall. Watching. I whipped around. Nothing. The closet was empty. But my heart was slamming so hard against my ribs, I thought I might pass out. I didn't even think. I just grabbed the closet door and shoved it shut, twisting the lock in place. I stepped back, breathing heavily, my entire body shaking. I needed to leave. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. I needed to get out of there. I spun toward the front door, my mind already racing through where I could go at this hour. But just as I took a step, the bedroom door slammed shut. I nearly screamed. I stood frozen, staring at the closed door, my ears ringing. I knew what I had heard. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. Something had slammed that door. Something was inside my apartment. My breathing was uneven, coming in short, sharp bursts. My entire body was locked in place, every muscle tense, waiting. And then, knock, 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 from inside my bedroom. I swallowed down bile. I had two choices, run or face whatever was inside. I should have run, but instead I took a slow step forward. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like it was alive. I reached out, gripping the bedroom doorknob with shaking fingers. Twisted it. Slowly, carefully, I pushed the door open. The room was dark. My bed, my desk, my nightstand, everything was where it should be. But something was wrong. The air felt different in here. Heavier. I reached for the light switch. Flicked it on. Nothing happened. I hit the switch again. Still nothing. The bulb had been working fine just earlier that night. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it at the room. And that's when I saw it. My bed. The covers had been pulled back, like someone had been sitting there. No! Like someone was still sitting there. I felt my stomach drop. I took a step back, barely able to breathe. My light flickered over the bed, over the empty indent in the mattress where something, had been just moments ago. And then, the closet door in my bedroom, the one I had left shut, slowly creaked open. I couldn't move. I just stood there, my breath coming in shallow gasps, staring as the darkness inside the closet seemed to shift, like it was breathing. Then, a whisper. Not words, just breath. Right behind me. I turned, and the light on my phone died. The second my phone screen went black, the room was swallowed in absolute darkness. No glow from the city outside. No blinking lights from the router or alarm clock. Just nothingness. And in that nothingness, I felt it. I wasn't alone. The air had changed. Thick, suffocating, pressing against my skin like something unseen was standing just inches away. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. I just stood there, heart hammering in my chest, waiting, praying that this was all in my head. Then, a sound. A slow, ragged inhale. Right behind me. I snapped my head toward the noise, my hands scrambling in the dark for anything to hold on to. The room was silent, but the feeling, that horrible, unbearable feeling of being watched, had intensified. I needed light. Now. With trembling fingers, I pressed the power button on my phone, desperate for the screen to come back to life. But it didn't. It was dead. Then, knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the closet door. No! Not from the door. From inside the closet. I wanted to run. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to get out. But my legs wouldn't move. I stared into the pitch-black closet, my body rigid with terror. And then, a whisper. Right in my ear. Not words. Just breath. Slow. Deliberate. Too close. I spun around, my arms swinging out wildly, trying to hit whatever was there. But my hand sliced through empty air. Nothing. And yet, the feeling remained. Something was there. I backed up slowly, my mind racing. My foot hit the leg of my bed, and I nearly stumbled. Then, my blankets moved. Not a twitch. Not a shift. They slid, like something underneath was crawling out. I couldn't breathe. I watched, frozen, as the fabric lifted, so slow, so deliberate, until I could see what was beneath. A hand, pale, too long, fingers curled as if ready to grab. I choked back a scream and lunged for the door. But before I could reach it, the closet door slammed shut, and the air shifted. The presence was no longer behind me. It was in front of me. I knew, without a doubt, that something was standing right there in the dark, staring at me. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up, to snap out of this nightmare. But then, breath. Not mine. Right in front of my face. So close. So unbearably close. And then, finally, I heard it. A voice. Low, raspy, crawling into my ear like it was coming from inside my own head. One single word. Run. And I did. I didn't think. Didn't hesitate. I bolted. I ripped open the door, sprinted down the hall, and threw myself out of my apartment. The second I stepped outside, the weight, the unbearable, suffocating weight, was gone. The hallway was silent. Right. Normal. I turned back toward my apartment, my chest heaving. My door stood open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. And then, the knocking started again. From inside my apartment. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was several floors down, panting, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The apartment hallway was eerily quiet, the soft hum of fluorescent lights the only sound around me. My phone was still dead. I couldn't call anyone, couldn't check the time, couldn't do anything but stand there, shaking, trying to piece together what had just happened. Had I lost my mind? Was I dreaming? Every rational part of me wanted to believe that I had imagined it, that it was just exhaustion or some twisted trick of my brain. But the knocking, I had heard it, felt it, and that voice, that horrible, rasping voice. Run! I knew it hadn't been a dream. I forced myself to take a slow, shaky breath and glanced up toward my apartment door. It was still open. From where I stood, I could see nothing but pitch black inside. No movement. No sign of anything waiting for me. But the second I took a step closer, that suffocating pressure returned. That feeling of being watched. And then, a single, soft knock. From inside. I turned and walked away. I left the building completely. I didn't care that I was barefoot or that I was wearing nothing but sweatpants and a thin t-shirt in the middle of the night. I just needed to be away from there. I ended up at a 24-hour diner a few blocks away. The kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and grease, where the waitress barely glanced at me as I slid into a booth at the back. I sat there for hours, my hands still trembling as I stared at the tabletop. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows. For a moment, I almost believed that everything was normal, that it had just been a nightmare. Then I glanced at my phone. Still dead. My apartment keys sat on the table in front of me, my fingers gripping them so tight my knuckles had turned white. I didn't want to go back, but I had to. By the time I stepped back into my building, it was late morning. The normal sounds of life had returned, people talking, doors opening and closing, the distant sound of a vacuum somewhere down the hall. It felt normal. I reached my apartment door and just stood there. It was closed now. Had someone shut it? I didn't know if I had the nerve to open it again, but I had nowhere else to go. My fingers felt numb as I slid the key into the lock. I turned the knob, hesitant, bracing myself, and pushed the door open. Silence! The apartment was exactly as I had left it. Nothing out of place. No sign of anything wrong. The only thing that told me I hadn't imagined it? The closet door. It was wide open. I didn't step inside right away. I hovered at the doorway, heart hammering, eyes scanning every shadow. The air felt off, not heavy, not suffocating like before, but like the place had been touched by something. I forced myself forward, checking every room. Nothing. Even my blankets were back on the bed, as if nothing had crawled out from under them. But I knew better. Something had been here, and something had told me to run. The only question was, why? Had it wanted me gone? Had it been warning me? Or had I barely escaped something I wasn't supposed to see? I didn't have answers. I just knew one thing. I wasn't staying. I didn't stay in that apartment another night. I packed a bag, just the essentials, nothing more, and I left. I didn't care about the lease. I didn't care about the deposit. I didn't care about what my landlord would say. I just needed to get out. That same day, I checked into a cheap motel across town. The kind of place with flickering neon signs and a receptionist who didn't ask questions. For the first time in weeks, I actually felt like I could breathe. But that feeling didn't last. The first night in the motel was quiet. No knocking, no whispers, no feeling of something watching me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The closet door, opening, the hand reaching out from beneath the blankets. The way the air had changed, like something had stepped too close. It was burned into my mind, replaying in my thoughts over and over. I barely slept. And then, on the third night, it happened. A single soft knock. Not from a closet this time. From the motel room door. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. It was nearly 3 a.m. No one should be knocking. I forced myself to stand, inching toward the peephole, my breath shallow. I looked. Nothing. Just an empty hallway. And yet, as I stood there, my hand resting against the door, I felt it again. That suffocating pressure. Like something was right there. Waiting. Watching. Following me. I don't know what happened in that apartment. I don't know what I saw or what had been trying to get out of that closet. I don't know why it told me to run. But I do know this. Some things don't stay in one place. Some things follow. And some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. Even now, as I sit here, in another new place, in another town, I still hear it. Not every night. Not often. But every once in a while, just as I'm about to fall asleep. Knock, knock, knock. And I know, without a doubt, it's still with me. Let me start by saying I wasn't one of those people who was ever too fond of creepy stories or ghost tales. Growing up, I was just a regular guy, living in the suburbs of a small town. Nothing too exciting or strange happened in my life, and that was perfectly fine by me. I worked a 9-to-5 job, lived in a modest apartment, and spent most of my free time hanging out with friends or watching movies. It was an ordinary evening when I first moved into my apartment. The place was quiet, tucked away in a corner of town where not much ever happened. A simple 2-bedroom flat, the kind that was more affordable than anything else in the area. There was a supermarket just a few blocks away, and that was pretty much the extent of excitement in the neighborhood. It was the kind of place where people went about their business, with no real reason to ever pause and look around. It was safe. But as I settled into this routine, there was one thing that stuck out, a strange sense of peace, like the world around me was too calm. The kind of stillness that you'd feel after a long day, when everything should be quiet, but something in the back of your mind tells you it's a little too quiet. I don't know how to explain it, but that was the atmosphere of that place. The apartment itself was nice, a small, simple space. The kind of place where you didn't have to worry much about maintenance or neighbors making noise. It met a few of the people who lived nearby when I first moved in, but they were the kind of folks who kept to themselves, which honestly I didn't mind. There was one older couple who lived in the unit across from me, and a young guy who worked long hours at a nearby restaurant. Other than that, the building was pretty empty. Days blurred into one another, and my life continued on as it always had, nothing too special. But there was this undercurrent, this strange feeling that I couldn't shake. It was like something was waiting for me just outside the door, in the hallway, behind the walls, or maybe even right next to me as I sat on the couch watching TV. I wasn't sure what it was, but the first time I noticed it, I shrugged it off. Everyone has an overactive imagination once in a while, right? That was the extent of my explanation, until everything changed. It was a Wednesday evening. I had just finished a long day at work, and by the time I got home, the sun had already set. There was this kind of chill that had crept into the air, nothing major, just that subtle shift in temperature that you only notice when you've been inside for too long. The apartment was, as usual, quiet. No one was in the hallway, and the sound of my shoes against the floor echoed as I walked inside. I remember taking a moment to close the door behind me, locking it and leaning against it for a brief second, just trying to shake off the fatigue of the day. It was just one of those nights where all you wanted to do was sit down, eat, and relax. I threw my keys on the kitchen counter, and without thinking too much about it, I went straight to the fridge. That's when I heard it, a faint sound coming from the hallway outside my door. At first, it was nothing, just a creak, like wood bending under some pressure. I brushed it off as nothing more than the usual sounds of the old building settling. But as I stood there, pulling out a can of soda, I noticed it again. This time, it was louder. A soft, rhythmic thudding, almost like footsteps. I froze for a moment. The building was old, yes, and things creaked, but these footsteps, they were different. They were distinct. Not the sound of pipes or the wind brushing against the windows. These were footsteps, the kind you hear when someone's walking down the hall. I glanced at the clock. It was 8:15 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one usually came by at this hour. And it wasn't like people would walk past my door at this time either. The building was practically empty. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe it was someone from one of the other apartments, or maybe my neighbor was coming home from work. They had to be, right? I mean, it was an old building, and the walls were thin, so sounds could echo in strange ways. I brushed it off, walked over to my couch, and sank into it, trying to focus on the TV. But that's when it happened again. The footsteps. But this time, they weren't just passing by. They stopped, right outside my door. I stood up, confused. I hadn't heard any voices or doors opening, just the sound of these footsteps, followed by complete silence. I walked cautiously over to the door and pressed my ear against it, listening intently. Nothing. I opened the door slowly, peeking out into the dim hallway. No one. Just the usual flickering light above me and the empty, quiet stretch of carpet that led to the staircase. I felt a strange unease creeping over me. Maybe it was a neighbor coming home or someone taking a late-night walk through the building, but the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. I didn't know what to make of it, so I just closed the door again, locking it behind me, and turned back to the TV. But no matter how much I tried to focus, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. It was like I could feel eyes on me from across the hall, even though I knew no one was there. I tried to rationalize it. It had to be the house settling. There was nothing unusual about it. But the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I found myself checking the locks on the door more than once. The next few days passed uneventfully. I didn't hear anything strange, and I went back into my routine. But every time I closed my apartment door, that feeling of being watched would creep back in. I started feeling like someone was there, just on the other side of the wall, waiting. It didn't help that the hallway was eerily quiet most of the time. Every now and then, you'd hear a door creak open or a muffled conversation from another apartment, but it always felt distant, like everyone was purposely avoiding the hall. One evening, about a week after that first incident, I was heading out to grab some food. As I passed the hallway, I stopped in my tracks. The floorboards creaked softly, but this time I could hear the sound of something or someone moving. It wasn't just footsteps. It was a dragging sound, like something heavy was being pulled along the floor. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it faintly, just down the hall, coming from the direction of the staircase. I paused, my heart racing in my chest. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt a cold sweat beginning to form. I wasn't imagining it. This time, it wasn't just a creak. It was a distinct sound, something unnatural. I turned and quickly walked back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. This wasn't just coincidence anymore. Something was going on, something I didn't understand, and it wasn't the kind of thing that could be easily explained away. I decided to try to distract myself by making a phone call to a friend. I needed someone to talk to, someone to tell me I was just overthinking things. But as I sat on the couch, phone in hand, I heard it again. The dragging sound. This time, it was louder, like it was coming closer. I stood up, heart racing. I walked to the door and opened it just a crack, peeking into the hallway. My eyes scanned the empty corridor, but there was no sign of anyone. The air felt colder now, though. It felt heavier, like the atmosphere had thickened around me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to ask for help. What could I say? That I heard footsteps? That I heard something dragging along the floor when no one else was around? I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Something, or someone, was out there. The days that followed felt heavier, thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edge of my perception, something waiting to step into the light. It wasn't just the strange footsteps anymore. It was everything. The air seemed colder, even in the summer months. The silence of the building pressed in on me, making it feel like the walls were closing in. I started to notice things more. Little things. The way the lights in the hallway flickered late at night, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should. The way the temperature would drop suddenly, as if a chill had settled in, only to fade again as quickly as it had arrived. And the noises, there were more of them now. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was doors creaking open and shut, muffled voices that echoed down the hall, even though there was no one there. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe it was just the sounds of my neighbors coming home late at night. But every time I opened my door, I felt that gnawing sense of unease, like someone was watching me from the shadows. One night, I decided it had enough. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I had to know what was happening. It wasn't just my imagination. Too many things had happened in too short a time. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending like everything was normal. I gathered the courage to open the door again, this time stepping out into the hallway. The air was thick with a strange, musty smell that I hadn't noticed before, like old paper and dampness. The hallway lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow on the faded carpet. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound, but even that seemed unnatural now, as though it were too loud, too insistent. I stepped into the hall and looked around. The hallway was empty, as usual. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just beyond the corner. I hesitated for a moment, then walked slowly down the hall, my footsteps soft against the carpet. I stopped in front of the staircase, where I had heard the dragging sound the other night. There was no sound now, just the silence that pressed down on me from all sides. I leaned over the railing, looking down at the darkened stairwell. The faint light from the hallway barely illuminated the first few steps, and the rest of the stairwell was swallowed by shadows. It felt wrong, like the darkness was waiting for me to look away so it could come closer. I walked over to the staircase and started down. The steps creaked beneath my feet, their sound exaggerated in the stillness of the building. The air grew colder as I descended, and I could see my breath in front of me. As I reached the bottom, I paused, listening for any sounds. There was nothing, just silence. But it was the kind of silence that felt alive, as if something was listening too. I turned the corner into the small laundry room, half expecting to find something there, but it was empty. I stood still for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't the first time it felt this way, but it was the first time it ever ventured out to check. There was no logical reason for me to feel so anxious, so unsettled. It was just a building, just a place where people lived. But the longer I stood there, the more it felt like something was moving, just out of reach. I felt it in the air around me, in the way the temperature had dropped. I could hear my heart beating in my chest, louder than ever before. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft creak like a floorboard shifting, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the shadows. The footsteps were getting closer. My pulse raced, and I took a step back. There was no one there, but the sound, those footsteps, were unmistakable. I couldn't stand it anymore. I turned and ran up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty building. I burst into my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the building, every soft noise made me jump, and I couldn't stop checking the door, making sure it was locked. I felt like something was waiting outside, just beyond the thin walls of my apartment. The next morning, I decided to do something I'd been putting off for too long. I needed to know what was going on. I couldn't keep living in fear, jumping at every sound. So I went to the building manager, hoping for some kind of explanation. Maybe there was something I didn't know, something about the building's history, or the people who had lived here before me. I found her in the office, sitting behind her desk, a stack of papers in front of her. She looked up when I entered, offering a polite smile. "Can I help you with something?" she asked. I've been hearing strange noises," I began, hesitating for a moment. "Footsteps, doors opening, things like that. I was just wondering if you could tell me if anything unusual has happened here." She blinked, her smile faltering for a moment. "Unusual? What do you mean?" I explained the noises, the footsteps, the dragging sounds. She listened quietly, but there was a shift in her demeanor. She seemed uncomfortable, like she wasn't sure what to say. "Well," she said after a long pause, "this building has been here for a long time. There's a lot of history in these walls. People come and go, and sometimes things get strange." She looked at me for a moment before adding, "But I wouldn't worry about it. It's probably just the house settling." The way she said it didn't reassure me. In fact, it only made me feel worse. "Is there anyone else who's experienced this?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked away, glancing at the clock on the wall as if waiting for something. Finally, she sighed. "I'm not sure. You're not the first to ask, but I'd rather not get into it. It's an old building, and there's always something going on in a place like this. People hear things. It's probably nothing." But as I left her office, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she wasn't telling me. And that thought only made everything worse. The building wasn't just old, it was hiding something. Something I wasn't meant to find. The rest of that day was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what the building manager had said. I kept replaying her words over and over in my head. It's probably nothing. But everything in me screamed that it wasn't nothing. There was something here. Something I couldn't explain. That night, I sat in the dark, my mind racing. I had to find out what was going on, but I wasn't sure where to start. Maybe I could ask some of the other tenants. Maybe they had experienced the same things. Or maybe I'd have to do it on my own. I didn't know. But whatever it was, I wasn't going to ignore it anymore. I had to know the truth. It had been a week since I last spoke to the building manager, and each day felt heavier than the last. The noises had grown more frequent, more intense. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat without feeling like something was watching me from the corners of the room. My nerves were frayed, and my mind, once sharp and clear, felt like it was unraveling. That night, something changed. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. No, it was worse, far worse. It started in the early hours of the morning, just as the first hint of daylight began to seep through the curtains. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the muffled sounds of the building settling around me when it started. At first, it was quiet, so faint that I almost didn't catch it. But then it grew louder, closer. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they came from just outside my bedroom door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear them clearly now, each step slow and heavy, like someone was pacing back and forth. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I stared at the door, my hands clutching the sheets, my body stiff with fear. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, and for a moment there was nothing, only silence. My heartbeat was deafening in my ears. Then came a soft scratching sound, like nails running across wood. It was so close, it almost felt like the scratching was coming from inside the room itself, from the corners of the walls or the floor beneath me. My stomach twisted into knots, and I fought the urge to scream, to jump out of bed and run. But my body wouldn't obey. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The house went silent again. For a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the stillness in the room was almost suffocating, and I could feel my nerves on edge, knowing that something wasn't right. I waited, still as stone, for what felt like hours. But when I finally worked up the courage to move, I got out of bed, my legs weak beneath me. The door, still closed, was all I could focus on. I crept toward it, every step heavy with the weight of dread. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I paused, listening intently, but there was no sound. The house had gone eerily quiet again. Slowly, I turned the knob and opened the door just a crack. At first, I saw nothing. The hallway was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long down the walls. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The walls were scratched, deep, jagged marks that ran along the edges, as though something had tried to claw its way through. My breath hitched, and I backed away from the door. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a deep, gnawing fear starting to claw at my chest. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The shadow. It wasn't just a shadow of a person. It was something more, something darker. It shifted, moving quickly down the hallway before disappearing into the darkness. I took a step back, heart racing, my body almost frozen with terror. I could feel the panic rising in my throat, choking me. I didn't know what to do. Should I call for help? Run? But I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it had its way with me. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving with each frantic breath. I had to get out of there. I needed to leave, but I couldn't. The building had a hold on me, and I couldn't escape it. I could hear the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, pacing up and down the hallway, getting closer, growing louder. It was as if the thing knew I was awake now. It knew I had seen it. In a burst of panic, I grabbed my phone and dialed the number of the building manager. It rang once, twice, and then, click. She answered. Hello? Her voice was groggy, and I could hear the sound of sheets rustling in the background. Please. Something is happening, I gasped, barely able to get the words out. There's something in the building. I don't know what it is, but it's real. I need help. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could feel the silence stretching between us, thick and suffocating. Then, in a quiet, almost inaudible voice, she said, You shouldn't have asked about it. Now it's too late. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, my heart hammering in my chest. What did she mean by that? Too late for what? I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep my grip on reality. My body was trembling, my mind on the edge of breaking. But just as I was about to collapse onto the floor in fear, I heard it, a voice. A whisper, low and hollow. It's not over. I spun around, searching the room for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty silence of the room, pressing in on me like a vice. But I could feel it. The presence. It was in the room with me, in the very walls, in the air around me. I couldn't escape it. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was something far worse. Something that had been waiting for me. And then the door. The door opened on its own. I didn't know what to do. My body was frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. I stared at the door, watching as it slowly creaked open, inch by inch. Through the crack, I saw the dark shape again, the figure that had been following me for so long. It was closer now, closer than ever before. The shadows seemed to reach out, stretching toward me, swallowing up the light. Then, as if it had been waiting for me to make a decision, the door slammed open with a deafening crash. The room went cold, and I could hear the sound of ragged breathing, deep, strained, like something struggling to take a breath. And then, in that terrifying moment, I realized it was coming for me. The world went black. I don't remember how long I was unconscious, but when I finally came to, it felt like I was waking up in a nightmare. My head was pounding, my body trembling uncontrollably, as if the very essence of fear had seeped into my skin. I was still in my apartment, but it felt different. The air was thick, unnaturally still, as if something was watching me, waiting for me to move. I forced myself to sit up, clutching my throbbing head. My eyes scanned the room, my pulse racing as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The door was still wide open, the darkness of the hallway stretching out like a void. But there was no figure standing there anymore, no presence lingering in the shadows. Had it all been a dream? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that I had barely escaped something more than just a nightmare. As I stood up and moved toward the door, the memories came rushing back, of the footsteps, of the whispers, of the shadows that had haunted me relentlessly. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. The moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, a wave of dread washed over me. I pulled my hand back, my thoughts racing. I couldn't leave, not without knowing what had truly happened. The answer to this nightmare had to be somewhere in the building, somewhere that would help me understand what had been chasing me. But I didn't feel safe. The building itself felt like a trap, its walls closing in on me. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. The footsteps had been growing louder, closer, and now it seemed like something had broken through, something that wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The phone call I had made to the building manager echoed in my mind. It's too late now. What did she mean by that? Why had she said those words, as though she knew something I didn't? Something I wasn't prepared for. I grabbed my phone again, dialing her number once more. It rang several times before I heard the familiar click, followed by her voice on the other end. Hello? I could hear the tiredness in her voice, but there was something else too, something cold, something that made my stomach turn. I need answers, I said, my voice shaking. What's happening in this building? What did you mean by too late? There was a long silence, longer than I had ever known before. I could almost hear her weighing her options, debating whether or not to tell me the truth. Then, her voice, barely a whisper, came through the line. You shouldn't have asked, she said softly, but now you're involved, and there's no turning back. I felt a chill run down my spine. Her words were cryptic, but I understood enough. I wasn't the first person to experience these horrors. I wasn't the first one to see the shadows, to hear the footsteps that never stopped. She had known, and perhaps even worse, she had allowed it to happen. I'm leaving, I said, my voice steady despite the panic that gnawed at my insides. I don't care what happens. I'm not staying here another night. Her laugh on the other end of the line was hollow, devoid of any comfort. "You won't make it out that easily," she murmured. "Once it's attached to you, it never lets go." I hung up, my heart racing. I didn't know what she meant by that, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. My mind was already made up. I was leaving. I grabbed my coat, shoved it on quickly, and moved toward the door. But just as my hand reached for the knob again, the room plunged into darkness. The lights flickered, then went out completely, leaving me in pitch black. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and heavy, the air thick with fear. I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I pushed harder, my fingers slipping against the handle. The walls seemed to close in on me, the space feeling smaller, more confined, as though the very building itself was rejecting me. Then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. It was here again. That thing. I wasn't safe. I couldn't leave. In a surge of desperation, I ran to the window and threw it open, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. The streets below looked deserted, but the thought of stepping outside into that vast, empty world felt like a lifeline. I didn't think. I didn't stop to question what might happen next. I climbed out the window and scaled down the fire escape with all the speed and strength I could muster, my heart pounding in my ears. By the time I reached the ground, I was gasping for air, my legs weak beneath me. I had escaped the building. I was free, or so I thought. I looked back at the structure, watching as the windows glowed faintly, as if the building itself were watching me leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that something was still there, still waiting for me. But I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep living in fear. I had to get away. But as I walked further into the night, away from the place that had held me captive, I realized something. The footsteps, the whispers, they weren't confined to that building. They were with me now, following me, just like they had before. It wasn't just the building that had been haunted. It was me. I had been marked. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that place, it would never leave me. The shadows would always be there, waiting in the dark. I had thought that escaping the building would be the end of it, that once I stepped out of the shadowed halls, the footsteps would stop, the whispers would fade, and I could finally reclaim some semblance of peace. But I was wrong. The city was quieter than usual that night. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few late-night commuters making their way home. It should have felt calming, but instead, the silence was suffocating. I glanced over my shoulder once, twice, just to make sure I wasn't being followed. But there was nothing. No figures, no shapes. Just the cold, empty street. Still, something lingered, something that gnawed at the back of my mind. The footsteps had been following me, not just the echoes in the hall, but in my very soul. How could something so pervasive, so deeply ingrained, simply disappear? I kept walking. My heart was heavy, burdened by the weight of what had happened, by the knowledge that I couldn't outrun my own fear. I couldn't outrun it. The journey home was long, and with every step, I tried to push away the growing dread that was beginning to creep back in. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, stretching shadows that seemed to reach for me, desperate to drag me back into the darkness I had just escaped. I pulled my coat tighter around me, though I wasn't cold. I needed answers. I had to understand what had happened, why it had happened to me. But I knew deep down that no answer would make the terror go away. There were no explanations that could make sense of what I had lived through. This wasn't something that could be solved, not by anyone. I thought about the building manager's words, her cryptic warning. Once it's attached to you, it never lets go. What did she mean by that? How could something like this follow you, cling to you in such a way? And how could it be so persistent, so powerful? It made me question everything. My life before the apartment, The quiet moments I had taken for granted. Were the shadows always there, lingering on the edge of my vision? Had I missed something in my ordinary life that would explain how I was marked, chosen, haunted? I couldn't tell you how much time passed, or if I even made it back to my apartment. The truth is, I didn't feel like I was truly home anymore. Home was supposed to be a place of safety, of refuge. But now, it felt like a trap, just like the apartment had felt. A place where the darkness waited. I didn't want to go back inside, but I had nowhere else to go. As much as I hated it, I knew I had to face the truth. I pushed open the door to my apartment, the same way I had done countless times before. But this time was different. This time, I could feel it, the presence. The very air was thicker, suffocating. I stepped inside, and for a moment, everything was still. But then, that unmistakable sensation, the footsteps, they were there. Not just in my mind, but physically. I could hear them now, faintly, echoing through the apartment, moving closer. I wasn't sure if I should be terrified or relieved. I had already lived through the worst of it, hadn't I? Or was this only the beginning? The fear surged through me again, stronger than ever. There was no escaping it now. This wasn't something I could fight or outrun. The entity, whatever it was part of me now. It had claimed me. And though I had tried to run, I had only delayed the inevitable. There was no real closure. No ending that tied everything together neatly. No heroic escape or final battle where everything was made right again. What I realized in that moment was that some stories don't have endings. Some things don't just go away. I glanced at the doorway, hearing the quiet shuffle of footsteps moving closer, always just behind me, no matter how far I walked. The weight of the past few weeks, of everything that had happened, pressed down on me, and I finally understood. The footsteps weren't just following me. They were a part of me. My story had merged with the dark, and now there was no turning back. And that's the hardest part to accept, the knowledge that no matter how hard you try to leave, the shadows will always be with you, just behind your back. You'll always hear the footsteps. You'll always feel the cold brush against your skin. And no matter how much you wish, you'll never be able to outrun it. As I sat down on the couch, I tried to steady my breath, but I couldn't. The footsteps had caught up to me, and as they grew louder, I knew with a sick certainty that they would never stop. This story, something that still haunts me to this day, started on what I thought would be a normal weekend getaway. I needed a break. Work had been overwhelming, and I was looking for a peaceful place to recharge. After a long week of stress, the idea of a quiet hotel away from the noise seemed like the perfect solution. It was a small, old hotel tucked away in the hills, nestled just outside the city. I had passed by this place a few times in the past, but it had never crossed my mind to stay there until a few days before. The moment I stepped inside, there was an odd familiarity to the place. Something about it felt like it had been stuck in time. The thick wallpaper, the antique furniture, and even the smell of aged wood and dust gave the place a strange but comforting vibe. It wasn't luxurious, not by any stretch, but it had character. It felt like it had stories to tell, even though I didn't realize just how dark those stories would be. I had checked in around sunset. The lobby was dimly lit, with a flickering chandelier above. The receptionist, an older woman with glasses perched at the edge of her nose, handed me the key to room 206 without a word. I thought it was odd that she didn't even ask if I was okay with my room choice, but I brushed it off. She didn't seem to want to engage in conversation, which was fine with me. I just wanted to get to my room and relax. I didn't think much of it then, but looking back, I can't help but wonder if she knew something I didn't. The hallway leading to my room was eerily quiet. with only the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. I noticed the paint on the walls had begun to peel in places, and the carpet was worn out from years of use. There was a deep, almost suffocating stillness in the air, as if the hotel itself was holding its breath. But I kept going, more curious than concerned, figuring it was just the atmosphere of an old building. Room 206 was at the far end of the hallway. The door creaked as I opened it, and I immediately felt the temperature drop a few degrees. It wasn't cold, exactly, just noticeably cooler than the hallway. I set my suitcase down by the bed and looked around. The room was fairly standard, nothing to write home about, but nothing to be concerned about either. A queen-sized bed with an old quilt, a dresser, a small desk, and a window overlooking the woods outside. The only thing that caught my attention was the mirror above the dresser. It was large, framed in tarnished gold, and I swear the surface was darker than it should have been. It looked as though it hadn't been cleaned in a long time. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light and began unpacking. After I finished setting up, I decided to grab a bite at the hotel's small restaurant. The food wasn't great, but it was enough to fill my stomach. The waitress was polite, but seemed distant, as if her mind was elsewhere. As I ate, I noticed that the other guests were few and far between. The restaurant was mostly empty, save for a couple sitting at a far table, staring into their plates in silence. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just the time of day. After dinner, I returned to my room, ready to relax. The plan was simple: take a shower, watch some TV, and get a good night's sleep. But as soon as I turned on the TV, I realized that it didn't work. The screen flickered briefly, but no picture ever appeared. It wasn't a huge deal, so I shrugged it off and decided to just read for a while instead. The hotel provided a few old books, mostly mysteries and thrillers, which seemed fitting given the place's vibe. I picked one up and settled in, ready to forget the stress of the week. But as I sat there, reading by the dim light of the bedside lamp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was subtle at first, just a small sensation, like I was being watched. But I dismissed it, chalking it up to nerves. It'd been in plenty of quiet places before, and it was easy to get spooked when you were alone. Still, the unease lingered as I read on. The room began to feel smaller somehow, as if the walls were slowly closing in. The shadows from the dim lamp stretched longer, casting strange shapes across the room. I set the book down and tried to shake off the feeling. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, just a whisper in the distance, but it wasn't the sound of the wind or anything else I could explain. I sat up straight, my heart pounding, listening closely. Nothing. Just the silence of the hotel. I couldn't tell if it had been my imagination or if I had actually heard something, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I turned off the lamp, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers up to my chin, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Little did I know, that night would be the beginning of something that would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. I woke up the next morning feeling off, like I hadn't slept well, even though I knew I had. The sun was just beginning to peek through the blinds, casting a muted light across the room. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 7 o'clock. The feeling of unease that had lingered from the previous night hadn't gone away. In fact, it seemed to have intensified. I got up and went through my usual routine, brushing my teeth, getting dressed, and packing up my things. As I was preparing to leave for breakfast, I noticed something that made my heart race. The mirror above the dresser. The one I had noticed the night before. It was cracked. The crack ran diagonally from the top left corner to the bottom right, like something had struck it with force. I hadn't touched it at all, and I was certain it hadn't been that way when I first entered the room. My stomach churned as I stared at it. Who would they crack the mirror? And how? I moved closer, inspecting the crack. It wasn't jagged or uneven, it looked deliberate, almost as if it had been slowly etched into the glass. It wasn't a random break either. The kind of damage you'd expect from something heavy or sharp wasn't present. The crack itself seemed unnatural. I stepped back and shook my head. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. It could have been there before, and I simply hadn't noticed. It wasn't like the hotel was brand new, after all. Maybe the mirror had been cracked for years, and I hadn't paid attention. I gathered my things and left the room, trying to push the eerie thought from my mind. The hallway, still as silent as before, seemed even quieter now. The heavy silence felt almost oppressive. I took a deep breath and walked to the elevator, just wanting to get downstairs and get some food. As I stepped into the small dining area, I noticed something strange. The waitress from the night before was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar woman, a younger woman this time. She greeted me with a polite smile, though there was something in her eyes, something cold and distant. As she led me to a table, I saw a few other guests scattered around the room, but they were all oddly silent. No one spoke a word, and the tension in the air was palpable. I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in that room was holding their breath. I sat down and ordered a simple breakfast, eggs, toast, and coffee. As I ate, I couldn't help but feel like the people around me were watching me. I glanced at one man sitting at the table near the window. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, and I quickly turned away, unnerved by the intensity of his gaze. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud crash. A dish had fallen to the floor and shattered. The noise startled me, but as I looked up to see what had happened, I saw that no one was reacting. The woman who had dropped the dish simply bent down and started cleaning it up without so much as an apology. No one else in the room seemed to even notice the accident. They just kept eating, staring at their food in a trance-like state. I finished my meal quickly, my appetite completely gone. I paid the bill and left, eager to put the oddness of the dining room behind me. The lobby was quiet as it had been the day before, with the receptionist sitting behind the counter. But this time, there was something even stranger. She didn't look up when I passed. Not even a glance. I thought it was odd, but I didn't let it bother me. I had a whole day ahead of me to explore the area and distract myself from the unsettling atmosphere of the hotel. I decided to take a walk around the grounds. The air was crisp, the trees around the property thick with old growth, and the wind rustled the leaves in a soft, calming way. The place seemed peaceful enough, but something still felt wrong. That evening, I returned to the hotel, having spent a couple of hours in the nearby town, browsing shops and enjoying the fresh air. It was getting late, and I was looking forward to another quiet night. But as I entered the hotel, the atmosphere had shifted again. The once inviting space now felt colder, darker. The receptionist was still behind the counter, though this time she appeared to be talking to someone I hadn't seen before. He was tall, with a sharp suit and a stern face. I couldn't catch their conversation, but something about him seemed out of place. I glanced at the elevator and then back at the desk. The conversation stopped the moment I made eye contact with him. The tall man gave me a long, lingering look before turning and walking out of the lobby without a word. It left me feeling uneasy, like I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. I told myself it was just a strange encounter, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again. I went up to my room and, to my surprise, found the door slightly ajar. I hadn't left it that way, and I was sure I had locked it when I left. I pushed it open cautiously and stepped inside. The room was exactly as it left it, except for one thing. The bedspread had been disturbed. It wasn't just wrinkled or slightly moved. It looked like someone had been sitting there. The indentation of a body, the weight of a person, was clearly visible in the bed, even though I had been gone all afternoon. My heart began to race. My mind screamed that someone had been in the room, that I wasn't alone. I quickly closed the door behind me and checked every corner of the room. There was no one there, of course, but the feeling of presence, the sensation of being watched, was undeniable. I sat on the bed and tried to steady my breathing. This wasn't a big deal, I told myself. Maybe housekeeping had come in while I was out. But then I remembered something that chilled me to my core. The housekeeper from earlier hadn't been to my room. I had been gone for hours, and when I left, the hallway was empty. The sudden, eerie realization made my stomach flip. That's when I heard it again. Faintly at first, like a soft tapping. I stood up and walked toward the source of the noise, which seemed to be coming from the wall. At first, I thought it might just be the house settling, but the tapping grew louder. It was rhythmic, like someone knocking, but there was no one there. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing. There was no logical explanation for it, but there was no denying what I had just heard. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the wall, waiting for something to happen. But nothing came. The tapping stopped. I decided to go downstairs again to get away from the room for a while. As I made my way to the elevator, I glanced back toward the lobby. The receptionist was now staring directly at me, her eyes cold and empty. I shivered, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something deeply unsettling about her, something that made me feel like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped, stuck in a place where things weren't as they seemed, where the walls held secrets I wasn't supposed to know. The following days seemed to blur together, each one more unsettling than the last. I tried to push the strange occurrences to the back of my mind, but it was becoming harder. At first, I convinced myself that I was overthinking things, that I was tired, maybe just a little paranoid after the long drive. But the more time I spent in the hotel, the more I realized that something wasn't right. It started with the whispers. I had dismissed them at first as a figment of my imagination. But on the third night, they were undeniable. As I lay in bed, the room suffocatingly quiet, I could hear them, soft, almost indistinguishable voices, like people talking just beyond the walls. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster, straining to catch any words, but they were too faint, too far away to make sense of. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Old buildings make noise, right? It could be the pipes or the winds shifting the structure. But even as I reassured myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that the voices were coming from inside the walls themselves. And they weren't alone. The next morning, I went downstairs for breakfast, doing my best to ignore the sense of unease that seemed to cling to me like a second skin. The dining room was as silent as ever, but today the atmosphere felt thicker, heavier. The air felt stagnant, and the low hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed louder than usual. As I picked at my food, I noticed a new guest sitting at a table across the room. His eyes were wide, unnaturally so, as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't speak to anyone, but I caught him glancing around the room with a nervous energy, his hands twitching as if he was waiting for something. When he caught my eye, his gaze locked onto mine for a moment, and a chill ran down my spine. I quickly looked away, unable to hold his stare. He was still watching me, though, his eyes never leaving my face, and I could feel his gaze burn into me like a physical presence. After breakfast, I returned to my room and tried to shake off the feeling of paranoia that had been creeping in. But as soon as I entered, something caught my eye, a small object on the floor near the door. It was a coin, a rusty penny, lying face up on the carpet. It wasn't there when I left earlier that day. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. Nothing special, nothing unusual about it. But the fact that it had appeared out of nowhere disturbed me. I tossed it into the trash and decided to take a walk, needing to get out of the hotel for a while. The fresh air would clear my head, I thought. But as I stepped outside, I saw something even stranger. The hotel's large front windows, Windows I had seen through countless times before were now covered with an odd, thin layer of dust. But it wasn't like normal dust. This dust was arranged in patterns, a series of smudged handprints, as if someone had placed their hands against the glass and left a ghostly trail. My stomach twisted as I studied the marks. I hadn't seen them before. They weren't there when I arrived that morning, and I hadn't touched the windows myself. I wiped at the glass with the sleeve of my jacket, but the prints didn't budge. It was as though the marks were embedded in the glass itself. The wind had picked up, and I could hear it howling through the trees outside, sending a shiver through me. The hotel suddenly felt like a fortress, enclosing me in, trapping me in a strange web I couldn't escape from. I turned away from the windows and made my way to the back of the hotel, hoping to clear my head. That's when I saw her. The housekeeper, the one who had never spoken to me directly, was standing at the back of the building, staring at the ground. She was wearing the same dull uniform as before, but her posture was different. She seemed to be holding something in her hands, something small, but I couldn't make it out. She didn't notice me standing there, but as I watched her, I felt a strange pull, an inexplicable desire to approach her. But something stopped me, an invisible barrier between us that I couldn't quite explain. I turned around and headed back inside, deciding I had seen enough. The walls of the hotel seemed to close in on me with each step I took, the air thick with the strange sensation that something was waiting, something was watching. That night, I couldn't sleep. The voices had returned, louder this time, rising and falling in a disjointed rhythm. I sat up in bed, staring at the cracked mirror across the room. The voices seemed to come from all around, their whispers merging with the soft tap of something against the walls, like a distant knocking. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out if the hotel had a history, if there was something about it that explained the strange occurrences. I decided to ask the receptionist when I went downstairs. Maybe she would know something, anything, that could explain why this place felt so wrong. But when I got to the lobby, she was gone. In her place stood the tall man I had seen the other day, the one with the sharp suit and the cold, empty stare. He was standing near the front desk, his back turned to me. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should approach him, but something in the air told me not to. It wasn't just his presence that unsettled me, it was the way the room felt when he was there. The space around him seemed to warp, as if the hotel itself was bending to accommodate him. I walked quickly past him, trying to ignore the chill crawling down my spine. As I reached the stairwell, I heard a soft sound behind me, like footsteps, slow, deliberate, following me. I spun around. No one was there. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The higher I climbed, the more the strange sensation grew. Something was closing in on me. I didn't know what it was, but it was getting closer, pressing in from all sides. I reached my room and locked the door behind me, my hands trembling. But even as I tried to calm myself, I couldn't ignore the sense of dread that was building inside me, the feeling that something was waiting for me. And then I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't just coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the room, from the mirror. I turned to face it. The crack in the glass, the one I had thought was harmless, was now spreading. Slowly, methodically, the crack stretched across the mirror, inch by inch, as if it was being formed by something on the other side. My heart hammered in my chest, and I couldn't look away. The tapping continued, each knock more insistent, until I thought my ears would bleed. It wasn't just knocking anymore, it was something worse. Something that felt deliberate, malevolent, like it was trying to break through. And that's when I saw it, a face. A faint outline at first, like a shadow moving behind the glass. But as the crack spread further, the face became clearer. It was staring directly at me. I was shaking uncontrollably as I stared at the cracked mirror. half expecting the face to reappear. My mind was spinning, unable to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me as I collapsed onto the bed. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tightening as the panic set in. This wasn't just some odd, unexplained phenomenon. No, this was something far worse, something I couldn't understand, something dangerous. I couldn't escape. I couldn't leave. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick and heavy. It seemed like the walls themselves were closing in on me, pushing down on my chest, forcing the air out of my lungs. My eyes flicked to the door, locked, I reminded myself. No way out. I was trapped here, and it was only a matter of time before whatever was behind that mirror came for me. I couldn't think straight. I tried to remember the logical explanations, the reasons this could be happening. Maybe it was some kind of psychological breakdown. Maybe I was just imagining everything. But deep down, I knew better. What was happening wasn't just in my head. The tapping started again, louder this time, more insistent. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, everywhere. It wasn't just the mirror anymore. It was as if the entire room was alive, alive with something dark and terrifying. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking as I stumbled toward the door. I had to get out. I had to find someone who could help me, someone who could explain this madness. But as I reached for the door, it swung open by itself. I froze, my hand hovering just inches from the handle, heart racing. I glanced over my shoulder, nothing. The room was empty, just as it had been when I entered. I stepped into the hallway, the cold, oppressive silence wrapping around me like a cloak. The air smelled stale, like something had been rotting in the walls for years. I could still hear the faint tapping, echoing through the corridors, growing louder and louder with every step I took. I didn't know what I was walking toward, but I couldn't stop myself. It was like I was being drawn forward by an unseen force. I rounded the corner and found myself standing in front of the stairwell again. I had no idea how I had ended up here. It felt as if the hotel was shifting around me, warping in strange, disorienting ways. I didn't know if I was even awake anymore. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Then I saw her again. The housekeeper, standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring at me with that same vacant expression. Her face was pale, drained of color, her eyes hollow, as though she hadn't seen a single ounce of light in years. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, as still as a statue. But there was something different about her now, something I couldn't put my finger on. It was like she was watching me. I could feel her gaze, heavy and suffocating, like a weight pressing down on me. I stepped closer, drawn by some strange compulsion I couldn't resist. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. As I neared her, I realized she wasn't looking at me at all. Her eyes weren't focused on me. No, they were fixed somewhere behind me, somewhere in the dark. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned around slowly, a chill creeping up my spine. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing at the end of the hallway. It was impossible to make out any details, just a dark shape, like a black silhouette against the dim light. But the longer I stared, the more I felt its presence. It was like it was pulling at me, drawing me closer to it with an almost magnetic force. I tried to speak, but no words came. My throat was dry, my voice stuck in my chest. I took a step back, my body trembling. The housekeeper's hollow eyes followed me as I moved, her head turning slowly, unnervingly, until she was facing me completely. The figure in the hallway took a step forward, and then another. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, locked in place by terror. My heart raced in my chest, each beat like thunder in my ears. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. It was like the hotel itself was holding me in place, keeping me rooted to the spot. And then, just as the figure was about to step into the light, it vanished. Like smoke in the wind, it simply disappeared, leaving behind only a heavy, oppressive silence. The air felt wrong, thick and stifling, like I couldn't breathe. The housekeeper, too, was gone. There was no trace of her. No footsteps. No movement. Just the emptiness of the hotel, stretching out before me like an endless maze. I turned and ran. I ran down the hallway, my feet slapping against the old wooden floors, echoing in the stillness. I could still hear the tapping, louder now, faster, as if something was chasing me. I didn't dare look behind me. I couldn't. I knew if I did, I would see it, whatever it was, whatever was following me. I burst into the lobby, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. But there was no one there. No receptionist, no guests, just the same cold, lifeless emptiness that had been haunting me since the moment I stepped inside. The door was ajar, the outside world beckoning me. I couldn't leave fast enough. I rushed out into the cold night air, gasping for breath as the chill of the outside world hit me like a slap. But even as I stumbled away from the hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me, lurking just behind me. I looked back once, just for a split second, and there, standing in the doorway of the hotel, was the figure. Tall, dark, and watching, waiting. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, and even then, I couldn't bring myself to stop. I stayed in a small motel for the night, my eyes flicking nervously to the shadows every time I closed my eyes. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that cursed hotel, I couldn't escape the feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever I had encountered there had followed me. And in the quiet of the night, I still hear it, the tapping. The soft, insistent tapping from behind the walls. The sound that will never let me forget what happened in that hotel. I thought I had escaped. I thought that leaving the hotel and putting miles between myself and the horrors I had encountered would bring some semblance of peace. But peace, as I quickly learned, was an illusion. For days after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My thoughts were consumed with the hotel, the strange, ominous presence that seemed to linger there. The image of that dark figure, its hollow eyes, and the way the housekeeper's gaze followed me everywhere, haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the tapping from the walls, rhythmic and insistent, echoing in my mind. I stayed in a different town, far from the hotel, hoping that distance would offer some relief. But no matter where I went, the feeling of dread followed me like a shadow. The tapping continued, faint at first, just a soft noise at the edge of my hearing. But as the days went on, it grew louder, more intrusive. It was as if the very walls around me were beginning to close in, suffocating me. I couldn't tell anyone what had happened. How could I? Who would believe me? A man alone, driven to madness by a hotel and a strange, inexplicable event? The more I tried to explain, the more I realized there were no words to describe the terror I felt. I couldn't even explain it to myself. The night terrors began, and they were more vivid than I could have ever imagined. In my dreams, I would find myself back at the hotel, walking down the same dimly lit hallway. The tapping would start softly at first, just a whisper in the distance, but as I walked, it grew louder, closer. I would open the door to my room, only to find the same cracked mirror, the same dark figure standing in the corner, waiting for me. And every time I tried to move, I couldn't. My body would freeze, locked in place by some invisible force. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, only to realize I was still trapped in the nightmare. I tried everything to stop it, changing my routine, staying in different hotels, even seeing a therapist. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that the hotel was still with me. It was as if I had unknowingly invited something into my life, something I could never undo. Months passed, and the tapping became a constant presence in my life. At night, it was as though the walls around me were alive, pressing in on me, reminding me of what I had left behind. I couldn't tell anyone. No one would believe me. So I kept it to myself, a secret that was slowly driving me mad. Then, one night, I received an unexpected phone call. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated before answering, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. "Is this Mr. Henson?" The voice on the other end was soft, almost mechanical, and yet there was something eerily familiar about it. "Yes, this is. Who is this?" There was a long pause before the voice spoke again. "We need to talk. You're not the only one who stayed at that hotel." My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea who was on the other end of the line, but I knew, somehow, that this was connected to everything. The tapping, the strange figure, the housekeeper, it was all part of something bigger. The voice continued, "I know what you've been through, and I know you're scared. But you're not alone. Others have experienced it too. We're all connected. You have to go back." I felt a wave of dread wash over me as the words sank in. "Back? Back to that place? No, I can't. I am done. I'm leaving it behind." There was a brief, almost sinister laugh on the other end. "You think you can leave? You think you can escape? It doesn't work like that. It never does." The line went dead. I sat there, stunned, the phone still pressed to my ear. The words echoed in my mind, filling me with dread. The tapping had been louder than ever that night, as if it were coming from within the walls of my own apartment. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't run forever. I wasn't just running from the hotel. I was running from something far worse. Something that I had no control over. The next day, I drove back to the hotel, my heart pounding in my chest with each mile. It was like some twisted force was pulling me back, urging me to confront whatever it was that had been tormenting me for months. When I arrived, I noticed immediately that the hotel was different. The once dilapidated exterior had been restored, its cracked paint and boarded-up windows replaced with a fresh coat of white paint and gleaming glass. It looked new, but there was something off about it. The air around it was thick, heavy, as if the hotel itself was holding its breath. I entered the lobby, and the receptionist, who had been absent the first time I arrived, was now standing behind the desk, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome back," she said, her voice sweet but hollow. "It's good to see you again." I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't tell her why I was there, what I had experienced. She wouldn't understand. The elevator creaked and groaned as I ascended to the floor where I had stayed. The familiar tapping was now a constant in my ears, growing louder with every step. When I reached the hallway, I felt the oppressive weight of it all, the darkness that seemed to fill every corner, the feeling of being watched. I was standing in the very place where it all began, and yet it felt different now. It was as if the hotel had changed somehow. I opened the door to the room, the same one I had stayed in, and was greeted by the same cracked mirror. But this time, something was different. The figure was there, standing in the corner of the room, its hollow eyes fixed on me. It wasn't the same shadowy shape as before. This time, I could see it clearly, its features, its outline, its presence. And then, the mirror cracked further, the glass shattering as the figure stepped forward. I ran. I didn't look back. I fled the hotel, leaving it behind for good. I never received another phone call, and the tapping eventually stopped. The nightmares faded, but I can't shake the feeling that I didn't truly escape. That whatever I encountered in that hotel still lingers, waiting. I never told anyone about the hotel, about the tapping, about the figure in the mirror. I don't know if anyone would believe me, but one thing is certain, I'll never go back to that place. And I'll never forget the horror I experienced. No matter how far I run, no matter where I go, the hotel's shadow will always follow me. It's been months since I last set foot near that hotel, and yet the memories of that place continue to haunt me. Not in the way I would have imagined, though. There are no more nightmares, no more tapping from the walls, no more shadowy figures lurking in the corners of my vision. But even with the passage of time, I still carry the weight of what happened. The last time I left that hotel, running as fast as I could, I thought I was leaving it all behind. I thought that by physically distancing myself from the place, I could finally shake off the curse that had latched onto me. I was wrong. It's not the walls of a hotel that can haunt a person. It's the feeling that something is waiting for you, something unseen, always just out of reach. The tapping, the figure, the broken mirror, those things weren't just confined to the hotel. They followed me, quietly at first, like a shadow I could never outrun. It wasn't the place that haunted me. It was the fear. The fear of knowing that there are things in this world beyond understanding, beyond explanation. I've moved several times since then, tried to build a new life. In each new town, each new house, I find myself still haunted by the thought of that hotel, by the things I saw and experienced there. Some nights, when the air is still and everything is quiet, I think I hear that tapping again. It's faint, distant, but it's there. A reminder that no matter how far I run, there are things in this world that I cannot escape. And then there are those moments when I'm standing in front of a mirror, and I catch a glimpse of something just out of the corner of my eye. I know it's nothing. I know that I've been living in this reality for long enough now to understand what is real and what is not. And yet, I can't shake the feeling that there's something behind me, just waiting. I've tried to explain what happened to me to others, to friends, to acquaintances, but no one ever seems to understand. They think it's just my mind playing tricks on me. They think it's the stress of life, the weight of 1,000 things piling up. But I know what I felt. I know what I experienced. I know that something was in that hotel with me, something that didn't want to let me go. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed, if I had gone back and confronted whatever it was that was waiting for me. Maybe the fear would have dissipated. Maybe I would have found answers and the tapping would have stopped. But I can't bring myself to return. The thought alone fills me with an overwhelming sense of dread, and so I keep moving forward, never looking back. In the end, I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of what happened. I don't know if I'll ever find peace. But what I do know is this. There are things in this world, things beyond our comprehension, that exist in the spaces between, in the shadows, in the forgotten corners of our lives. And once you've crossed paths with them, they never really leave. I don't know if I'll ever find the answers I'm searching for. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape. But I do know this. I'll never forget. And for the first time, maybe that's okay. Because in this world, some things aren't meant to be understood. Some things are just meant to stay hidden. Until the next time I hear the tapping, that is. This story takes place a few years ago in a small, quiet town I had moved to in hopes of escaping the noise and distractions of the city. It was the kind of place where the air was fresh, the streets were lined with trees, and everyone knew everyone else. I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship, and I was looking for something simple, a fresh start. I thought that moving into an old house on the edge of town would give me the solitude I needed. The house itself was massive, way bigger than I had originally anticipated. It was the kind of house you'd expect to see in an old movie, with creaky floors, long hallways, and windows that were covered with thick curtains most of the time. But the moment I stepped through the front door, I knew it was going to be my place. An elderly man who had been living in the house for decades, and he assured me that the place was well taken care of. To be honest, he looked like the kind of man who might have had a lot of stories to tell, but I never asked. It wasn't until I started settling in that I noticed some things that didn't seem quite right. My daily routine was simple, a blend of work from home and exploring my new surroundings. I'd wake up early, have some coffee, get to work at my desk, and then go for walks around the neighborhood in the evening. I spent most of my time inside the house, reading, watching old movies, and trying to find some peace after all the drama it left behind. The house, though old, was very comfortable, with high ceilings and plenty of space. There were rooms I hadn't even ventured into, and one in particular, upstairs in the attic, caught my attention. I hadn't really thought much about the attic until I noticed the door at the top of the stairs. It was an old wooden door, almost completely obscured by the boxes and furniture that were piled up in front of it. I didn't pay much attention at first, assuming it was just a part of the house that hadn't been touched in a long time. But the more I thought about it, the more curious I became about what might be behind that door. Why was it locked? What was inside? But like most people do, I let it sit in the back of my mind. There were more immediate things to worry about, and the attic was far from being at the top of my list. It wasn't until one fateful night that everything began to change. It had been a few weeks since I moved in, and life had settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. The house felt familiar by then, like it had always been mine, but the attic door, still locked and untouched, lingered in my mind. I wasn't obsessed with it, but I found myself glancing up at the stairs occasionally, wondering what was behind that thick wooden door. My mind started to wander, imagining old, forgotten things tucked away in the dark corners of that room, but I quickly brushed those thoughts aside. I didn't have time to dwell on something as trivial as an attic. Then, one evening, something happened that I couldn't explain. It was a cool night in late October, just as the sun was setting behind the trees. I had been working on my computer, sitting at my desk near the window. The house was quiet, too quiet, really. The usual hum of the outside world was absent, leaving only the faint creak of the house settling as the temperature dropped. It was the kind of quiet that made you uneasy, even when you were alone. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed it was just the wind, or maybe an animal scurrying across the roof. But then I heard it, a faint scratching noise. It wasn't loud at all, but it was distinct enough to make me stop what I was doing. I looked around the room, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound was coming from upstairs, from the direction of the attic. I froze, my heart suddenly racing. The scratching sound grew louder for a moment, almost like something, or someone, was trying to get out. I stood up from my desk, my legs suddenly feeling heavy as I made my way toward the stairs. The house felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer as I climbed the steps. My hand hovered over the attic door, and for a moment I debated whether I should open it. Was it just a branch scraping against the window, or was there something more to it? Something inside me told me I shouldn't open that door, but my curiosity overpowered my fear. I grabbed the handle and turned it. To my surprise, it didn't budge. The lock was still in place, but the scratching had stopped. It was as if whatever had made that noise had suddenly disappeared. I stood there for a few moments, listening, but there was only silence. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I shrugged it off as nothing more than an old house settling, or perhaps my mind playing tricks on me. That night, I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing things in the quiet, distant thuds, muffled sounds that seemed to come from behind the walls or the ceiling. I told myself it was just the house, the way it creaked and groaned as it settled. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I could feel it, the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. It wasn't like I was being watched, exactly, but there was this lingering presence, something that was just out of sight, but always there. The next few days were uneventful, at least on the surface. I kept myself busy with work and ignored the attic as best as I could. But every time I walked past the stairs, I felt a pull, like something was drawing me to that door. It wasn't a strong urge, but it was enough to make me pause, to make me wonder. Why hadn't I gone up there yet? What was behind that door? One evening, about a week later, I decided to go upstairs again. I had been working late, and as usual, the house was eerily silent. I walked up the stairs, passing the attic door. This time, something was different. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it like that, but maybe I had. Maybe I had gotten distracted and left it open, though I found that hard to believe. I couldn't have forgotten to close it. I hadn't even been near the stairs all day. I stood in front of the door, staring at the crack between the wooden panels. There was something strange about it, something unsettling. The air felt thicker here, like something was pressing down on me, but I couldn't explain why. I pushed the door open a little further and peered inside. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the dim hallway behind me. I couldn't see much beyond the outline of the furniture and boxes stacked up against the walls. It was just like it left it, nothing out of the ordinary. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I hadn't heard anything unusual. There was no sound, no strange feeling coming from the room. It was just a dusty old attic. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt that something wasn't quite right. It was as if the room was waiting for me, like it was holding its breath, ready for me to cross the threshold. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it again. A faint scratching sound, this time coming from the back of the attic. My heart skipped a beat, and I jumped back. I hadn't imagined it this time. There was something in that room. Something, or someone, was up there. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my mind racing. I stood there in the hallway, trying to catch my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but I finally gathered the strength to move. I went back downstairs, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. The house was old, after all. Old houses creaked, made noises, and sometimes things were just strange. But deep down, I knew this was different. There was something about that attic, about that locked door, that was beginning to feel like a problem I couldn't ignore. The days following the incident with the attic door were tense. The house, which had once felt like a peaceful refuge, now seemed to be suffocating. It wasn't just the strange noises. The house had started to feel alive in an unsettling way. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a shift, something that made every creak of the floorboards seem amplified, every shadow feel like it was watching me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. At first, I tried to push through it. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was still adjusting to living in an old house in a small town, and old houses made noises. I kept my daily routine, working, going for walks, and trying to sleep at night. But it was harder and harder to ignore the strange occurrences that began to multiply. It started with the cold spots. I would be sitting in my living room, the warmth of the sun streaming through the windows, when suddenly the temperature would drop. Not just a little, enough to make me shiver. It was like walking into an icebox for a moment, and then, just as quickly, the warmth would return. I couldn't explain it. The house had central heating, and I had checked the windows to make sure they were properly sealed. Yet, the cold spots seemed to appear at random, especially near the attic door. I would feel a chill creeping down my spine as I passed by, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. Then, the sounds started again, more frequent and much more disturbing. It wasn't just scratching anymore, it was dragging, scraping, and thumping. Sometimes I could hear footsteps, faint and soft, like someone was pacing back and forth above me. Other times, it sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sounds were too deliberate, too intentional. I wasn't the only one in the house, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever, or whoever it was aware of me. One night, after yet another unnerving incident, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to figure out what was going on. I couldn't keep living in fear, constantly wondering what was lurking behind that locked door. I had to know. I stood at the base of the stairs, looking up at the attic door. This time, there was no hesitation. I needed to face whatever was up there. I grabbed a flashlight, my hand shaking slightly, and made my way up the stairs. The house seemed unusually quiet, but I could feel the air growing thicker as I neared the attic. The temperature dropped again, but this time I didn't flinch. I felt determined. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stood in front of the door. It was still locked, but I could swear I saw something, just a faint shadow, move behind it. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. There was no way anything could be moving behind a locked door. But that nagging feeling wouldn't leave. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed the old key that had been left on the kitchen counter when I moved in. I hadn't given it much thought before, assuming it was just a spare key to the front door, but something told me it was meant for the attic. I unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The air inside was cold, and the smell of dust and old wood hit me like a brick. It was as if the room hadn't been opened in years, yet the smell seemed fresher than it should have been for something so untouched. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the stacks of boxes and old furniture, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a step inside, my feet crunching on the dust-covered floor. The beam of light from my flashlight danced across the walls, revealing the clutter of forgotten items, things left behind by the previous tenants or maybe even the house's original owners. But there was something else in the corner of the attic, a shape, a dark silhouette. It was hard to make out, but it was large and, from the looks of it, completely out of place. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every muscle in my body screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I had to know. I took a deep breath and slowly walked towards it. The closer I got, the clearer it became, a large covered object draped with an old, tattered sheet. The edges of the sheet were stained with what looked like age, but I couldn't tell what was underneath. I reached out to pull the sheet back, my hand trembling, but before I could touch it, I heard something. A whisper, soft and distant, like it was coming from inside the walls themselves. It sent a chill down my spine, and my heart skipped a beat. I froze, my hand hovering over the sheet. There was no one else in the house. No one but me. I quickly backed away from the object and turned to leave, but as I did, I saw something moving in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the room, too quick to fully catch. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. There was nothing there. Just the dim light reflecting off the old furniture and piles of boxes. My pulse was racing, and I could feel my breath quickening. It was as if the room itself was closing in on me. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I knew it wasn't something I could just ignore. I left the attic, slamming the door behind me and locking it once more. I tried to tell myself that it was all just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was in that room, something that didn't want to be found. And it was only a matter of time before it came out. The following days were a blur of unease. The strange occurrences became more frequent. I would find things moved, objects out of place, things I had never touched suddenly appearing on the floor or countertops. The house felt colder, darker, and even when I turned on the lights, it didn't seem to help. The shadows grew deeper, longer, and they seemed to follow me. But the worst part? I started hearing things. Not just the strange noises from above or behind the walls, but voices. Faint, muffled voices that I couldn't place. Sometimes they sounded like whispers, and other times like murmurs in the distance. But they were always there, always just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to find out what was behind the locked door. What was in that attic? And what was it that seemed to be reaching out to me from the shadows? I had to face whatever it was hit on, because there was no escaping it now. The house was no longer a refuge, it was a prison, and whatever was inside was waiting for me to uncover its secrets. I had tried to ignore it for so long, told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the stress of settling into an old house, the isolation of being in a new place, away from everything familiar. But after days of eerie sounds, moving objects, and the growing tension in the house, I knew I couldn't run from it anymore. I couldn't pretend that everything was normal when I felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me, suffocating me with something darker than I had ever known. That night, something was different. The atmosphere in the house felt charged, thick with an oppressive energy. The usual quiet of the evening was punctuated by soft but distinct sounds from above, thumping, scraping, and a faint tapping that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The attic door stood before me, locked again, but I could feel it calling to me, as if something behind it was pulling me in. I had no choice. I had to go back up there. The weight of the house, of the constant feeling of being watched, was unbearable. I couldn't keep living in fear of something I hadn't even fully understood. So I took a deep breath and made my way to the stairs. Each step up the old wooden staircase felt like a countdown. The house seemed to groan with every movement, the air thick and still, as though it were holding its breath. The shadows stretched longer in the dim light, and I could feel my pulse quicken with every inch closer I got to the attic. But I didn't stop. I was determined now. When I reached the door, the temperature dropped sharply. It was a sharp, biting cold that seemed to radiate from the attic itself. I could feel my fingers tremble as I fumbled for the key in my pocket, my heart pounding in my chest. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a groan that sent a jolt through me. The familiar musty smell of the attic flooded my senses, but there was something else, a heavy, stagnant air, like something had been sealed in here for far too long. I stepped inside, my flashlight illuminating the cluttered space, but this time the beam felt weak, as if the darkness was swallowing it. The shadows were deeper than before, more menacing. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the room, looking for the source of the unease that had been growing within me. The large, covered object in the corner caught my eye, the sheet now even more tattered, hanging loosely over whatever was underneath. Before I could take another step, a loud bang echoed from above, shaking the rafters and sending a rush of cold air through the room. My heart skipped a beat as I looked up, instinctively stepping back. The attic felt alive, as though the house itself was responding to my presence, its walls trembling with something that wasn't natural. The sound had come from the far side of the attic, a place I hadn't dared to explore before. I turned, my legs stiff, and began walking toward it, my flashlight flickering in my hand. The air grew colder, and the whispers began, faint, almost inaudible at first, but unmistakable. It was like a chorus of voices murmuring from somewhere deep within the walls. But no matter how hard I strained my ears, I couldn't make out what they were saying. The tension in the air was suffocating as I neared the far corner. The cold was unbearable now, cutting through my clothes and numbing my skin. I could feel the walls closing in, pressing against me. But the voices, they were getting louder, more insistent. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the corner, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as I stepped closer, the details became clearer. A tall, gaunt figure, draped in tattered rags. Its skin was pale, almost ghostly, and its eyes, dark, hollow, and empty, were fixed on me. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, as though it was waiting for me to do something. I froze. The flashlight fell from my hand, clattering against the floor as I stumbled back, my legs failing beneath me. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice caught in my chest. The figure didn't move, but it felt as if it was drawing closer, like it was somehow invading my mind, forcing me to face something I couldn't understand. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the figure. Its presence was overwhelming, consuming me from the inside out. The whispers grew louder, rising in pitch until they were a cacophony of unintelligible voices, all crashing over me at once. And then the room shifted. The walls seemed to bend and warp, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing. The attic, once a place of forgotten things, was now a prison, and I was trapped inside it. My pulse hammered in my ears, the air thick with an energy that I couldn't comprehend. I could feel the temperature plummeting, the cold so intense it felt as though my very breath was freezing in my lungs. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring the fear it had instilled in me. It reached out with a hand, long, bony fingers stretched toward me, and I could feel the air around them crackle, as if reality itself was warping in its presence. The whispers were deafening now, filling my head with a chorus of voices that begged, pleaded, and screamed for something I couldn't understand. I snapped. I turned and ran, my heart racing as I barreled down the stairs. The house seemed to stretch before me, the shadows chasing after me with every step. The sound of footsteps, heavy, dragging, followed close behind, the whispering voices echoing in my ears, growing louder with each passing second. I reached the door, fumbling for the handle, my hands slick with sweat. I yanked it open and slammed it behind me, my chest heaving as I gasped for breath. The house was silent again, but I could feel it. I could feel it watching me. Whatever was in that attic, whatever had been waiting for me, wasn't done yet. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't going to let me leave. The fear didn't subside. It gnawed at me, burrowing deep into my soul, because I knew that what I had just encountered wasn't over. The house still felt wrong. The air still felt heavy, and I could still hear the whispers in my mind. What was it that I had just uncovered? And what would it do next? It had only just begun. I couldn't sleep. I hadn't been able to for days. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that figure from the attic would flash before me, the hollow eyes, the icy, unnatural stillness. It was always there, in the back of my mind, clawing its way forward, dragging the terror into every waking moment. The voices still echoed in my head, whispering things I could never quite make out. Sometimes they would come in the dead of night, too faint to understand, but other times they were deafening, as though the walls themselves were trying to speak to me. I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. It was only a matter of time before whatever had been haunting that attic found a way to break free. But where could I go? I didn't know anyone here, not well enough to explain what had happened, and honestly, who would believe me anyway? No one would think twice about a few strange noises or weird feelings in a house as old as this one. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. So I did the only thing that made sense. I packed up everything I could, tossing clothes and personal items into bags without any real order. My hands were shaking as I moved through the house, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as if they were alive, aware of what was happening. The house felt even colder now, the air thicker with a heaviness that pressed against my chest. I reached the attic door once again. The key was still in my pocket, but I didn't dare open it. That door had been a threshold to something that I couldn't explain, and the thought of facing whatever was still up there paralyzed me. I couldn't go back. I couldn't confront it again. But even as I stood there, staring at that door, I felt something stir within me, a growing dread, like an unshakable weight on my soul. I had to get out of here before it was too late. The final moments in the house were a blur. I remember slamming the front door behind me, locking it shut as if to leave everything inside. The house, the figure, the darkness, all of it was behind me now. At least, that's what I thought. I made my way to a hotel just outside of town, far enough to feel removed from the nightmares of that house, but close enough that I could still drive back if I needed to. That first night away, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. The silence of the hotel room was a sharp contrast to the unnerving sounds of the house. The whispers, the thumping from the attic, the cold air, it was all gone. Or so I thought. It was late into the night when the knocking began. At first, it was gentle, a soft tapping against the window, like the rain hitting the glass. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate, until it was pounding against the panes. My heart raced, and I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, that I was being paranoid. But then the whispers started again, low and indecipherable, but unmistakable. I bolted upright in bed, the covers tangled around my legs as I strained to listen. The voices were clearer now, their words sharp and urgent, like they were demanding something. I could almost hear them beckoning me, calling me back. I couldn't escape it. I had tried to run, to leave everything behind, but it followed me. The presence, the fear, it wasn't just confined to that house. It was attached to me, haunting my every step. The figure from the attic wasn't done with me. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone. I didn't know what I hoped to find. I hadn't told anyone about what had happened who would believe me. But as I scrolled through the contacts, my finger hovered over the number I had been avoiding. The one person I could turn to for help, even if they'd never believe a word of it. I called. I didn't know what to say, but I needed help, desperately. The phone rang several times before they picked up. The voice on the other end was groggy, still half asleep, but it was enough. "Hello?" they asked. I need help," I choked out, barely able to form the words. "It's happening again. It's following me." There was silence on the other end for a long moment. I could hear the rustle of sheets, the sounds of someone trying to wake up. "What are you talking about?" the voice finally asked, disbelief lacing their words. "I can't explain it," I said, my voice shaking. "It's real. The attic. The thing in the house. It followed me here. Please, you have to believe me. I'm not crazy." There was another pause, and then they sighed, as if unsure whether they should even entertain what I was saying. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe it's the stress, or maybe you just need some rest. But it'll come by in the morning, all right? You're not alone." But that wasn't enough. I couldn't wait until morning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that I wouldn't be able to escape. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, my mind racing with panic. Every creak of the hotel building, every gust of wind outside felt like a sign that it was getting closer. The fear was so raw, so overwhelming, that it felt like I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even bring myself to call back, to beg for help again. What was the point? The thing had already found me once. It wouldn't stop. Morning came, but the terror didn't lift. I left the hotel before anyone could come. I didn't even pack my bags. I just walked out, not looking back. I couldn't solve it. I couldn't figure out what it wanted or how to stop it. All I knew was that it wasn't just a house. It was something far worse, something that had followed me, and no matter how far I ran, it would always be right behind me. I drove for hours, away from the town, away from everything that reminded me of what I had seen. I couldn't stay in one place for too long, couldn't settle into the idea of home. Because I wasn't sure I had a home anymore. I wasn't sure I would ever be free. But as I sat there, trying to steady my breath on that long drive, one thing became clear. The house hadn't just been a place. It had been a doorway, and it was still open. I never went back. The thought of stepping foot near that house again, let alone reopening the attic door, was too much to bear. I had packed my things, left town, and made a fresh start somewhere new. The faces were different, the streets unfamiliar. I found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood where the only thing I could hear at night was the soft hum of the city from a distance. It was peaceful. At first, it felt like I was finally safe. But peace, like everything else, was fleeting. As the weeks turned into months, I convinced myself that I had escaped, that the nightmare was behind me. I didn't even think about the house, not consciously at least. I threw myself into work, spent time with people who didn't know the truth about my past, and kept myself busy. I pushed the memories down, buried them where I couldn't reach. The whispers, the figure, the coldness, those things were from another life, another version of me that I no longer recognized. But there was always something, a nagging sensation that wouldn't go away. I remember the first time it happened. It was a simple sound, a knock on my door. It was late at night, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as the familiar chills spread through my body. The knocking grew louder, more persistent, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stood motionless, listening, trying to make sense of it. My breath caught in my throat as my mind screamed at me to check the door, but I couldn't move. I didn't open the door. The knocking stopped, but I could feel its weight in the air, as though it had left a mark on the very space around me. I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe the building settling, the wind. I forced myself to believe that, but I didn't sleep that night. A few days later, I found a small note tucked under my door. No name, no address, just a single sentence written in jagged handwriting. It's not over. I stared at those words for what felt like hours. My hands trembled as I held the paper, the ink blurring as my palms began to sweat. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but I knew what it meant. It was a message from the thing in the attic, the entity that had haunted me all that time. It had followed me, just as I feared. I wasn't safe. The fear that had started in the house, in that attic, had never really left. It had only waited, dormant, like a seed buried deep inside me. And now, it was growing again. I tried to be rational, to dismiss the thought that whatever had terrorized me in the past was still here. But deep down, I knew there was no way out of this. The house might have been miles away, but the thing, whatever it was, had found me. And it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. I didn't know what it wanted, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The entity wasn't just tied to the house, to the physical place. It was tied to something deeper, something within me. It had never been a matter of location. It had been a matter of fate, or something far darker. I went to the authorities, tried to explain what had happened, but of course, they didn't believe me. They thought I was just a troubled person, someone who had been through something traumatic and was struggling to move on. They gave me resources, therapy recommendations, all the usual things. They didn't know what had really happened in that house, what I had truly seen. No one would ever understand. Even I wasn't sure what to make of it anymore. The more I thought about it, the more it started to feel like a dream. Something surreal. A twisted nightmare that wouldn't end. But the more I tried to run from it, the more I realized there was no escape. I had to face it. I returned to the town. I didn't know why. Something inside me felt like I had to. I drove past the old house, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. I kept going, down familiar streets that now seemed foreign. My heart pounded in my chest as I made my way back to the place where it all began. I thought that if I could just confront the memories, the fear, I could finally put it to rest. When I arrived, the house was still there, but it didn't feel like the same place. It was as though the air itself had changed, as if the walls were watching me. The once silent house now seemed alive, waiting. I didn't want to go in, but something pulled me toward it. Something primal. I stepped onto the front porch and reached for the door. It was still locked. But when I tried the knob, it turned. The door creaked open on its own. I stepped inside. I expected the darkness, the cold, the strange sounds. But it was different this time. The air was thick with silence, too quiet. The oppressive presence that had once filled this place was gone. At least, that's what I thought. I made my way up the stairs, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. I reached the attic door and, without thinking, opened it. The room was empty. Nothing was there. No figure, no shadows, no whispers. But then I noticed it, something on the floor. A single, weathered photograph. It was of me, from before. I bent down to pick it up, my heart racing. The edges were frayed, as if it had been there for years. I turned it over. The back was covered in scribbled words. You never left. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath. I don't know if it'll ever truly escape. I don't know if there's a place where it can't find me. But one thing is for sure. It's not over, and it never will be. The house, the figure, the whispers, they've become a part of me. They're inside me, following me, waiting. And I'm not sure if I'm ever going to get away. The apartment was a bit outdated, with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors that would sometimes groan under my weight. But it had charm. The kind of charm that spoke of history, of lives lived within these walls. I spent most evenings at home, usually just watching TV or reading, maybe ordering takeout if I was too lazy to cook. The apartment had a small kitchen, a modest bathroom, and a living room that was just big enough for a couch, TV, and a small coffee table. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, and I enjoyed the peace it provided. There was one thing, though, that I could never quite shake off: the feeling of being watched. But that could just be the product of living alone in a building that had seen better days. I dismissed it, telling myself it was simply the old pipes or the strange noises the building sometimes made. After all, it wasn't unusual for a place like this to have its quirks. In fact, I never thought much of it. That night, like most nights, I settled on the couch with a book in hand. It was the middle of November, and the weather outside had turned cold, with gusts of wind howling through the cracks in the old windows. I'd been reading for a while when I felt it, a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a faint sense that something wasn't quite right. I glanced around the room, expecting to see the usual shadows cast by the dim light of the lamp. But there was something different about the way the room felt now, something heavier. I shook it off as my imagination and turned the page of my book, trying to get back into the story. But then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible creak from the hallway outside my apartment door. It was faint, but unmistakable. I paused, my fingers frozen on the edge of the page. The sound wasn't entirely unusual. The building had its fair share of old pipes, and I had grown used to hearing noises in the night. Still, there was something about the timing of it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I set the book down and stood up, my heart rate picking up just slightly. The hallway was dimly lit, with only a single light bulb above the stairs, casting a faint glow. I took a cautious step toward the door, then paused. The sound hadn't repeated, and the hallway outside seemed still and silent. I let out a breath I hadn't realized it'd been holding, reassuring myself that it was just another old house noise. Still, something lingered in the air, a nagging feeling that I couldn't quite ignore. I walked back to the couch and resumed my seat, trying to push away the growing sense of unease. I chalked it up to the fact that I had been alone for a while, and loneliness sometimes plays tricks on your mind. I tried to focus on my book, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the sound. It had come from the hallway, yes, but it wasn't the noise of the pipes. It had been more like footsteps, deliberate, slow, almost like someone was walking just outside my door, but there was no one there. I didn't want to overthink it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced toward the hallway once more, just to reassure myself that everything was fine. But the shadows in the corners of the apartment seemed darker than usual, the kind of darkness that almost seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It wasn't much, just a strange noise and a fleeting sense of unease. But for the first time since moving in, I began to feel like I wasn't completely alone in that apartment. The following days after that first strange night felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the apartment seemed quieter somehow, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The creaks and groans of the old building were more noticeable, and the usual rhythm of my days was interrupted by the constant feeling that something wasn't quite right. I tried to go about my usual routine, but it was as though my mind had shifted. I began paying attention to the little things I hadn't noticed before, the way the floorboards squeaked just a little too loudly when I walked through the hallway, or how the bathroom light flickered at random intervals. The faint hum of the refrigerator, which used to blend into the background noise, now sounded almost too loud. It was as if I was more aware of everything around me, hyper-aware of the slightest shifts in the air or sound. It was on a Wednesday evening, as I was making a quick dinner of pasta, when the first real incident occurred. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, when I heard a distinct noise from the living room. It wasn't a creak this time. It was a loud thump, the kind you'd expect from something heavy falling to the floor. My heart raced for a moment, and I froze, knife in hand. I thought maybe I had dropped something, though nothing had been near the edge of the counter. But I quickly dismissed that possibility. I put the knife down and walked into the living room, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the apartment. There was nothing on the floor. The couch was exactly where I had left it, the coffee table in its usual spot. I scanned the room, my eyes pausing on the dark corner near the window, but everything seemed perfectly normal. I let out a breath, convincing myself it was just the sound of the old building settling again. Still, the unease I had been feeling for the past few days grew, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I walked back to the kitchen, but my eyes kept drifting back toward the living room, as if expecting something to happen. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was just off. When I went to bed that night, I left the light on in the hallway, a small comfort against the growing sense of discomfort. The shadows in the apartment seemed deeper than usual, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I felt as though they were creeping closer. The next morning, I was running late for work, trying to quickly get ready. I had just stepped out of the shower when I heard it again, this time much clearer. A thump, followed by a dragging sound. It was coming from the hallway, just outside the bathroom door. My heart skipped a beat as I froze, towel in hand. I waited, listening intently, but the sound stopped just as abruptly as it had started. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my phone and sent a quick text to a friend, asking if they dropped by or if anyone was supposed to be in the building. But the reply came back almost instantly. No, they hadn't been there, and no one had mentioned visiting. I told myself I was just overthinking it. Maybe I was just tired. The noises I was hearing, they could have been anything. Perhaps the wind had picked up, causing the old building to creak and groan. The dragging sound was probably just the pipes, or so I convinced myself. However, over the next few days, I started to notice more and more of these subtle disturbances. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned home to find that the living room lamp, which I had left turned off that morning, was now on. I couldn't remember leaving it on. I checked the light switch. Nothing was unusual. It was as if someone had switched it on after I had left. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it felt wrong. The idea that someone else had been in my apartment, even briefly, unsettled me. I had no reason to believe it was anything more than my own forgetfulness. Still, the sensation of being watched was growing stronger. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed thicker, heavier. The worst part was the cold spots that began to appear in the apartment. At first, it was just a slight chill in the air, barely noticeable. But as the days passed, the cold spots became more frequent and more intense. It wasn't like the usual drafts you'd get from an old building. These areas of cold seemed to appear randomly, lingering in certain spots of the apartment, by the hallway, near the door to the bathroom, and worst of all, by the window in the living room. It wasn't the type of cold that you could simply explain away as a draft from outside. It felt unnatural, as if something was hovering in the space, blocking out the warmth. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to try and find the source of the cold spots, thinking maybe there was something wrong with the heating system. I spent hours moving around the apartment with a thermometer, checking different rooms and corners. But no matter where I went, the cold spots didn't make sense. The kitchen, which should have been warm from cooking, had the coldest spot near the sink. The bathroom, which I had just used, felt like it had a chill in the air. I shook my head in frustration, telling myself it was just an old building with heating issues that hadn't been addressed in years. I didn't have any concrete explanation, but I tried my best to brush off the discomfort. That was until one morning when I woke up to a strange sight. On the kitchen counter, directly in front of me, was a coffee cup. It was the cup I always used, the one I kept by the sink, but I hadn't left it there the night before. It was placed carefully, as if someone had set it down after using it. My first thought was that I must have done it, absent-mindedly, but I couldn't remember touching it at all the night before. And there was no sign of the coffee I would have made, no mug with stains from a recent drink. At this point, my nerves were on edge. I couldn't dismiss the weird occurrences anymore. It wasn't just the noises or the cold spots. There was something in the apartment, something. Watching. The strange events seemed to be escalating, and I had no idea what was happening or why. I had considered calling someone to check the apartment for any kind of natural explanation, but deep down, I knew there was something more going on. something that I couldn't explain. Each day that passed, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I didn't want to be alone anymore, but I had no choice. The apartment was mine, and I wasn't about to let whatever it was taken from me. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment had become something other than what it had once been. The quiet of the apartment, once a comfort, now felt suffocating. The strange incidents weren't just subtle signs anymore. They were louder, more obvious. And with each passing moment, I became more certain of one thing. Whatever was in my apartment wasn't going to leave without a fight. The strange occurrences that had started subtly now began to grow more frequent, each one more intense than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being slowly pushed towards something I couldn't yet understand, something inevitable. The apartment had changed. I felt it in my bones. The cold spots, the strange noises, they weren't isolated incidents anymore. They were part of a pattern, and the air in the apartment had taken on a heaviness I couldn't describe. It wasn't just that the temperature was lower. It was as though the air itself was pressing in, suffocating me, making it harder to breathe, as though something unseen was watching and waiting. The first night I stayed in the apartment after that was the hardest. I had convinced myself I would be fine. After all, I had been living here for months. The apartment was nothing special, a two-bedroom on the fourth floor of an old building. I wasn't new to living alone, but this time, everything felt different. As I tried to settle in for the night, I pulled the blankets tightly around me, hoping the weight of them would help to comfort me. But sleep didn't come. I kept hearing it. The soft scraping noise again, faint but unmistakable, coming from the living room. It wasn't the old floorboards creaking like it used to be. This was something else, more deliberate, like something was dragging across the floor, just out of sight. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Slowly, cautiously, I got up and padded barefoot into the living room, my heart thudding in my chest. The apartment seemed to hold its breath as I stood there in the doorway, staring into the darkness. Nothing was moving. I flicked the light switch, but nothing changed. The apartment remained bathed in shadows, as if the light wasn't even strong enough to fight off the growing sense of unease that clung to every corner. I hesitated, then slowly stepped into the room. The dragging sound stopped as soon as I moved, but I could feel the silence pressing in on me. It wasn't a normal silence. It was thick, oppressive. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. It could be a rodent, maybe, something in the walls. Or perhaps I was imagining things. I walked further into the room, eyes scanning the floor for any sign of something unusual. Nothing. But that's when I noticed it. The window. The one I always made sure to lock at night. It was wide open. My stomach dropped. I knew I had closed it before going to bed. I had always been careful about it. And yet, there it was, hanging open, the cold breeze from outside swirling in and making the curtains flutter. I stood there for a long moment, just staring. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It felt as if someone had been there, watching me, and I had just missed them. The idea of someone breaking into my apartment didn't make sense. I was on the fourth floor, and the window was the only way in. But the more I thought about it, the more irrational and terrifying it felt. I quickly shut the window, locking it and pulling the curtains tight, as though shutting out the night would somehow block out whatever had been there with me. But the unease didn't leave. It lingered in the back of my mind, creeping into my thoughts, making it hard to focus. The next morning, I tried to go about my day, telling myself it was just a fluke. Maybe the wind had blown the window open. Maybe I had just forgotten. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The apartment felt wrong. Over the next few days, the disturbances increased. At first, it was small things I could brush off as coincidental. The radio, which I swore it turned off, would be on the next morning, blaring static. It'd turn it off, but the next day, it would be back on. The cold spots grew more intense, creeping up the walls and making the air seem thick, like it was pressing against me, pushing me into the corners of my own home. The worst incident came a few days later. I had just come back from work, my mind heavy with the stress of the day. I opened the door, expecting to hear the usual creak of the hinges, but instead, the door swung open with ease. I stopped, my hand still on the doorknob. The air inside the apartment felt colder than usual, but there was something else, something deeper. It was the smell. At first, I couldn't place it, but it was unmistakable once I recognized it. It was the scent of damp earth, like something had been buried beneath the floorboards. I stepped cautiously inside, my pulse quickening. The living room was dark, as if the sunlight had been drained from the air. I flicked on the light, and there it was, an object lying on the floor in the center of the room. A piece of string. But it wasn't just any string. It was knotted, like someone had been tying and untying it, and the knots were too deliberate, too precise, to be an accident. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing on end. I knew I hadn't left it there. The only explanation I could think of was that someone else had been in the apartment, but I couldn't make sense of it. I spent the rest of the evening pacing around the apartment, checking locks and windows, searching for any signs of intrusion, but everything seemed as it should. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, the air thickening around me. It was as though the apartment was holding its breath again, waiting for something to happen. The next few nights were even worse. The noises grew louder, more distinct. I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, faint but persistent, moving around in the hallway when I was in bed. The tapping of fingernails on the wall. The air in the room would grow icy, and I'd feel the cold, clammy touch of it against my skin. I was convinced that whatever was here, whatever had been dragging the furniture around and opening windows, wasn't just some random occurrence. It was something purposeful, something that wanted me to know it was there. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. Every shift in the shadows made me jump. I couldn't remember the last time it felt this on edge, this out of control. I knew I had to figure out what was happening. I couldn't keep living like this. But every time I tried to confront it, the apartment seemed to push back, making me question whether I was just imagining everything. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained. The creeping fear had become a constant companion, gnawing at my thoughts day and night, and no amount of sleep or distraction could make it go away. The strange occurrences had only escalated, the air thick with something I couldn't explain. But tonight, I decided to do something about it. I wasn't going to sit idly by while whatever this was continued to torment me. I had to know what was happening, even if it meant confronting whatever was lurking in the shadows. As the evening settled in, I made a decision. I would stay awake, stay alert, and wait. I set up my phone on the coffee table, recording everything in case I could catch something on film, anything that could help me understand what was going on. I didn't know if it would work, but it was all I could think to do. I turned off the lights, pulling the curtains tightly closed, and sat in the darkness, the quiet of the apartment pressing in on me. Hours passed. The apartment was deathly still, as if it too was holding its breath. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and grow, darkening further as time dragged on. The silence became suffocating. The only sound was the occasional creak of the floorboards, the house settling, or was it? I couldn't be sure anymore. My senses were heightened. Every little noise made my pulse quicken. My eyes darted from corner to corner, looking for any sign of movement, any sign that I wasn't alone. Then, at exactly 2:37 a.m., it happened. The air shifted. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I felt the chill all the way through to my bones. The cold spot was back, this time stronger than ever, and it was moving, shifting around the room. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, my heart hammering in my chest. Something was wrong. Something was wrong in the deepest sense of the word. I grabbed my phone, trying to steady my shaking hands as I recorded, hoping that whatever was about to happen, whatever was causing this, would reveal itself on camera. And then I saw it, out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement. My heart leapt into my throat. The figure, or whatever it was, didn't appear clearly at first. It was more like a shadow, a dark outline that shifted and distorted, merging with the dark corners of the room. I couldn't make out any defining features, just a tall, imposing figure that seemed to grow from the very walls of the apartment. It moved with a fluidity that didn't belong in this world, like something that had never been human. I froze, not knowing whether to run or try to confront it. My entire body felt as if it had been paralyzed, yet my mind was screaming at me to act. But my legs wouldn't move. My heart thudded so loudly in my chest that I thought for sure it would give me away, would alert whatever it was to my presence. Then, as though it sensed my fear, the figure began to approach. Slowly, deliberately. The closer it got, the more tangible it became, the more real. I could feel its presence in the room, pressing against me, suffocating the air. The shadows seemed to bend and shift in response to it, as though they were drawn to it, dancing at its command. I tried to speak, to call out, but no words came. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, constricted. The figure stopped in front of me, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from it, colder than anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't like a normal chill, it was deep, an unnatural cold that sunk straight into my bones. The room was filled with a low, almost imperceptible hum, vibrating the very walls. The air was thick with a sense of malevolence, something ancient, something angry. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally, its form distorting in a way I couldn't comprehend. I tried to move, tried to get up, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. But I could feel it, the pressure in the room increasing, like the weight of 1,000 hands pressing down on me, forcing me to stay in place. And then I heard a voice, not spoken aloud, but inside my head. It was low, guttural, and it didn't belong to anyone. It was other, something beyond comprehension. The voice didn't say words. It was more like a command, an order that I felt deep in my soul, an order to submit. Leave now. I couldn't respond. I couldn't do anything. The figure was so close now, I could almost feel it touching me, its cold presence pressing into my very being. Its form flickered, shifting in and out of focus, but its eyes, if you could even call them that, were the worst part. They weren't eyes in the way I understood them. They were empty, hollow spaces, black as voids, yet they were filled with something I couldn't begin to explain. They seemed to look through me, into something deep inside, as though it knew all of my darkest fears, all the things I had buried deep within myself. I thought I would pass out. My body was shaking uncontrollably, my breathing shallow and erratic. Every instinct in me screamed to get away, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by fear, overwhelmed by this presence that I couldn't understand. Suddenly, without warning, the figure recoiled. It jerked back as though it had been burned, the shadows around it twisting violently before it vanished completely. The room was quiet again, but the silence was deafening. I was still frozen in place, my body unwilling to move, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight had lifted slightly. I could feel my legs again, but they felt weak, as though they couldn't support me. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, trying to process what I had just witnessed. It had been so real, so vivid, that I couldn't deny it had happened. But what was it? What was that thing? I sat there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, my mind racing, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to leave, to run far away and never look back. But another part of me, a part that was terrified of the unknown, couldn't bring myself to leave the apartment because I knew that whatever was here wasn't going to let me go that easily. And that was when I realized the truth. It wasn't just the apartment. It wasn't just the building. Whatever had been haunting me wasn't bound by walls. It wasn't confined to a place. It was something older, something darker, something that had found me. And now, it would never let me go. The hours that followed were a blur. My mind was in a state of complete chaos. I felt like I was drifting, caught between the terror of what I had just experienced and the overwhelming need to make sense of it. Part of me wanted to run, to flee the apartment, the building, everything. But another part of me felt anchored, paralyzed by fear, unable to make the decision to leave, knowing deep down that whatever was here would just follow. I didn't sleep. It was impossible. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to shut off. It was running on overdrive, replaying everything that had happened. The figure, the cold, the voice. It was too much to process, too much to comprehend in one sitting. And that's when I realized there was no explanation for it. No logical reason why any of this had happened, and certainly no way to make it go away. This wasn't a normal haunting. It wasn't something I could escape by moving out or calling in some professional to rid the place of spirits. It was something far worse. I spent the next few days in a fog, barely able to leave my apartment. I tried reaching out to a few friends, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them everything. I knew they wouldn't understand, not really. They wouldn't believe me. I could barely believe it myself. So I stayed silent, locked in my apartment, trying to figure out what to do next. I decided to investigate. Maybe if I understood the history of the place, maybe if I understood why this was happening, I could make it stop. I pulled out old records of the building's history, scouring them for any signs of strange occurrences or past residents with unsettling stories. The deeper I dug, the more I found. There were rumors about the building, rumors of strange disappearances, whispers of events that no one would talk about, things that had happened long before I moved in. But there was no concrete proof, no direct link to what was happening to me. Just stories. Stories that made my skin crawl. One afternoon, after hours of research, I stumbled upon something. A name. A name that was connected to the original architect of the building. A man who had vanished under mysterious circumstances many years ago. His name had been erased from most records, almost as if he had never existed. But there it was, in a dusty, old newspaper clipping, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the archives. And beside it was a brief mention of something darker, something about a curse. The curse of the architect. The article didn't go into detail, but the implication was clear. Whoever or whatever had caused this man's disappearance had left its mark on the building. I wasn't sure if it was the architect's spirit or something else, but whatever it was, it had latched onto me. It had followed me into this apartment, and now it wasn't going to let go. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been chosen, or worse, that I was being dragged into something far bigger than myself. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't dealing with a typical haunting. This wasn't some restless spirit. This was something much older, much more powerful, something that fed on fear. And it wasn't going to stop until it had consumed me. I knew I had to leave. It was the only way to stop it, to escape the grasp of whatever had a hold on me. But that thought brought its own terror. How do you escape something that isn't bound by the rules of the physical world? How do you outrun something that can manipulate reality itself? I had no answers, only a sense of impending doom that tightened around me like a vice. The fear became unbearable. I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. The walls seemed to close in on me. the air heavy with something I couldn't identify, but could feel pressing down on me at all times. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure. I saw its cold, hollow eyes staring back at me, its presence looming over me, suffocating me. The very thought of going back into that apartment was enough to make me want to run and never look back. But that wasn't an option anymore. On the final night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get out. The apartment, the building, everything. It didn't matter. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed, that whatever it was, whatever had been haunting me, wasn't just going to let me walk away. But I didn't have any choice. I couldn't stay there another night. I moved in with a friend for a while, hoping that distance would be enough to put some space between me and whatever had followed me. But even now, I can't shake the feeling. It's like it's still out there, watching me. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, the shadows in the corner of the room feeling just a little too heavy. The memories linger, taunting me. I don't know what happened in that apartment. I don't know what I experienced, what was in that building with me. And I don't know if it's truly over. It could still be out there, still watching, still waiting. But I've learned that some things are better left unanswered, better left in the dark. And so, I live with the uncertainty. I live with the knowledge that sometimes there are forces in this world that we can't understand, that we can't escape. There are things that can't be explained, and there are moments when you come face to face with something that is so terrifying, so beyond comprehension, that all you can do is try to survive it. So that's what I did. I survived. But I'll never forget. Looking back, it feels surreal to even consider that any of it was real. At times, I wonder if I just went through some kind of psychological breakdown, a phase where the pressure of my everyday life twisted my perception of reality. But when I close my eyes, when I remember the details, the coldness, the shadows, the figure that stood in the corner of my room, unblinking, I know that something happened. Something I can't explain. Something that left a mark on me that I'll never truly shake off. That apartment was the beginning of my understanding that there are forces at play in this world far beyond what we can perceive with our eyes or understand with our minds. People talk about the supernatural like it's some abstract concept, something you can casually dismiss. But after what I experienced, after what I lived through, I can't view the world the same way. I've heard it said that the past never truly leaves us. It echoes, fades, and resurfaces in ways we can't predict. I feel like that's what happened with me. Whatever dark thing that had its roots in that apartment, maybe it had been lying dormant for years. Maybe it had just found me. It didn't matter. The truth is, some things are too powerful to be controlled. Some things leave a scar on your life that never truly heals. And while I'm not certain if you'll ever fully understand the events that unfolded in that place, I can't deny that they changed me. I spent weeks after I left, looking over my shoulder, unsure of who or what might be following me. The paranoia wasn't just something in my head. It was a gut-deep instinct that something was out there, somewhere. It wasn't until I moved that I could breathe again. But even now, I'm not sure if I'm completely free from whatever was in that apartment. There are nights when I'm in a new place, a new town, and I'll hear a knock at the door. Or I'll hear the creak of the floorboards behind me when no one is there. In those moments, I freeze, my heart pounding in my chest, the terror coming rushing back to me. I don't know if it's my mind playing tricks on me, or if the thing I encountered isn't finished with me yet. I've thought about going back to the building. I've thought about confronting whatever is still lingering there, trying to find the answers that eluded me before. But the thought alone terrifies me. I don't know if I'm strong enough to face it again. The truth is, I don't want to know. For now, I'm trying to move on. I've stopped researching the building, stopped digging through old records. I've stopped looking for explanations. I've realized that sometimes there are things in life that just don't have answers. Sometimes the fear, the unknown, is just part of our existence. And maybe we're not supposed to understand it. That apartment is long behind me now, but its presence still hangs in the air, even in the places I go. It's not something I talk about often, but in the quiet moments, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can still feel the weight of it, the shadow of something that once tormented me. I wonder if, somehow, it will always be with me. I don't have closure. I don't have a neat ending to wrap up the story. But what I do know is that I'll never forget. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the suffocating chill in the air, the unrelenting sense that something was just out of sight, waiting for me to turn around. I'll never forget the terror that gripped me, the confusion, the realization that I was not safe. I'll never forget that night. And I'll never forget what it taught me, that some things are far too terrifying to comprehend. That there are forces in this world that we can never fully understand, things we'll never be able to escape. All we can do is survive. Survival. That's all I could do. And I did. I survived.